Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. Eric Leask, 51 years old, was known as a kind and generous man, always ready to help those in need. He treated everyone with warmth and compassion, leaving a deep impression on all who had the chance to meet him. Furthermore, he was very devoted to his family and cherished every moment with his loved ones. Eric has numerous talents, but his greatest passion is art. He is enthusiastic about sculpture and possesses the ability to transform ordinary objects into unique works of art. His tireless dedication to art, combined with his humble personality, makes him both talented and admirable. Every detail in his works reflects meticulousness and a drive for perfection. However, around 9 p.m. on March 9th, a tragic incident occurred when a detective from the Idaho Falls Police Department was called to the 100 block of 4th Street to investigate a shooting. Eric's wife reported that when she and her husband awoke, they discovered a suspicious individual breaking in through the front door. In a panic, the intruder attacked her son. Without hesitation, Eric rushed to protect the child. However, the suspect fired multiple shots, injuring the son in his legs and arms, while Eric was severely injured in the shoulder and chest. Immediately following the incident, ambulances from Idaho Falls quickly transported both Eric and his son to the Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center for emergency treatment. Unfortunately, due to the severity of his injuries, Eric did not survive. Fortunately, the son gradually recovered and was discharged from the hospital afterward. In an interview with the police following the incident, Eric's son stated that he was playing video games in the bedroom when he suddenly heard a knock, followed by loud banging at the door. When the suspect burst into the house, he was wearing a mask, dressed in dark clothing, wielding a weapon, and loudly demanding that they surrender their property. After causing serious injuries to Eric and his son, the suspect fled the scene. Some local residents also reported to police that when the suspect ran away, they saw that his hand was injured. A few hours later, the Idaho Falls police received information about a man who had been shot in the arm. This individual had asked a friend to help remove the bullet and assist him in leaving the area. At around 11 p.m., the police followed a lead and located the suspect, Lance, at the Teton Mesa apartment on 885 Lomax Street. When the police requested Lance to surrender, he refused to cooperate, resulting in a tense standoff with the Special Weapons and Tactics SWAT team. Ultimately, law enforcement had to use chemical irritants to force him outside. He surrendered shortly afterward and was taken to the Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center, EIRMC, for treatment as the bullet remained lodged in his arm. At the hospital, Lance told the police that earlier that evening, he had gone to Eric's house to obtain marijuana. He admitted to being involved in a scuffle at the house and being shot during this altercation. However, through their investigations, authorities found no link between Lance and Eric's family, which weakened the theory that he had gone there to obtain marijuana from them. The police believed that Lance went to the wrong house, which led to this tragic incident. Notably, at the time of the incident, Lance was under federal supervision and had an outstanding arrest warrant for a serious crime. It turned out that he had a history of violent offenses. In July 2020, U.S. District Judge B. Lynn Windmill charged Lance with aggravated assault for stabbing a man in the abdomen at the Fort Hall Reservation and for stealing a pickup truck. Subsequently, in April 2021, he was sentenced to over 3 years and 4 months in federal prison in Sheridan, Oregon. Lance was also ordered to serve 3 years of probation after completing his prison sentence. In November 2023, Lance was arrested and charged with aggravated assault after attacking a man with a baseball bat. However, Bonneville County Prosecutor Randy Neal stated that the charges in this case were dismissed because one of the key witnesses refused to cooperate. Bonneville County Prosecutor Randy Neal has officially filed 5 felony charges against Lance Bronco. The charges include first-degree murder, aggravated assault, robbery, theft, and illegal possession of a weapon. He has also sought an enhancement of the sentence because Lance used a weapon while committing serious offenses such as murder and assault. If convicted of first-degree murder, Lance could face the death penalty or life in prison with a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years. For the other charges, sentences can range from 5 years to life imprisonment. According to the prosecutor's office, the enhancement of the sentence due to weapon use could add 15 years of prison time for the 2 serious charges. Lance is at risk of facing the death penalty, so a judge has decided to hold him without bail. In March 2024, at just 23 years old, Lance was charged with 5 serious offenses related to the death of Eric Leask. Following an investigation and trial, on August 12, Lance pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated assault. He initially faced charges of first-degree murder, robbery, theft, illegal possession of a weapon, and aggravated assault. However, 3 other charges were dropped as part of a plea agreement. On October 7, 2024, Lance Bronco was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years for first-degree murder, along with an additional sentence of 10 to 15 years for aggravated assault. Both sentences will run concurrently. However, later, Bonneville County Prosecutor Randy Neal requested the death penalty for Lance and sought to revoke his plea agreement. Neal stated that Lance had repeatedly violated the terms of the agreement. Specifically, on March 14th, he was found in possession of a homemade weapon in the correctional facility. Subsequently, on May 9th, he was arrested for drug possession, and on July 6th, he was again found in possession of a shank. In addition, Lance was charged with assaulting a staff member during an exchange of items between cells, including his own. This action led to a lockdown of the cell block, during which drugs and a shank were discovered. When asked to stand up to be taken outside, Lance assaulted a deputy sheriff, necessitating the restraint of him on the floor by 5 officers. Then, the deputy sheriff attempted to speak with Lance, but Lance refused. The following day, July 11th, the deputy sheriff received an email regarding a letter from Lance's holding cell. In the letter, Lance stated that he had attacked one officer and headbutted another. He also threatened that if the police continued to disrespect him, he would take further action. The deputy sheriff suspected that this might be a sign of a plan to smuggle drugs into the prison. The tragic death of Eric Leask serves as a reminder of the unexpected dangers that can arise in everyday life. Eric was not only a brave man who defended his family, but also a man with a kind heart who left a deep mark on all who knew him. Lance Bronco's violent actions, born of thoughtlessness and poor decision-making, cost an innocent man his life. As the legal proceedings continue, we hope that justice will be served, providing some measure of comfort to Eric's family. Case 2. The case of Sidney Powell. Brenda Powell was born in 1969 in Saline, Agua, USA. She graduated from high school and then attended Acro University. After completing her studies, she began working as a pediatrician in the oncology department of her local children's hospital. For over 28 years, she has dedicated herself to helping sick children. Brenda oversees inpatient care and is known to her peers and hospital staff as a calm, quiet person who is exceptionally kind to both patients and their parents. In November 1996, Brenda, 27, married Stephen Powell and took his last name. They were introduced through a mutual friend who worked with her at the hospital. The couple enjoyed a happy life together for 23 years and welcomed 2 children, a daughter named Sydney and a son named Andrew. Since childhood, Sydney has been passionate about sports, especially football. Her family watched football together every Sunday, which helped strengthen their relationship. They also regularly visited the beach and Disneyland. As Sydney grew older, she and her mother, Brenda, began to spend more time together. While her father and brother watched football, they enjoyed shopping, which further strengthened their relationship. Sydney did well in high school, which helped her pass her exams and gain admission to Mount Union University, where she also received a scholarship. In college, she became friends with Lauren and a group of female students while living on campus. She participated in school events and was introduced to many different activities. Friends described Sydney as friendly and easygoing. Sydney's academic journey took an unexpected turn after her first year. Initially, everything seemed fine. She excelled in her classes and was praised by her teachers, ranking among the top students. Sydney began working part-time during the summer holidays to earn extra money. However, during her second year, Sydney faced significant challenges and decided to move off campus. Her friends were initially confused by this sudden decision, but later learned that Sydney was struggling academically. Her grades were dropping. Additionally, Sydney began sleeping excessively, often around 16 hours a day. Sydney's friends thought she could handle it all because she was a smart and hard-working student who had previously done well in school. Unfortunately, Sydney struggled and ended up failing 3 out of 4 exams. Due to strict regulations, she received a notice of expulsion from the university, which shocked everyone. Sydney was worried and shared her concerns with her friends. Fortunately, they informed her that she could reapply for admission. At the beginning of 2020, Sydney resumed her studies, attending classes and sorority meetings. She happily told her friends that she had been readmitted to the university and was doing well. In early February, Sydney was notified that she had to leave the school permanently and that her expulsion would remain in effect. She was offered assistance with moving and packing, and the school planned to notify her parents of her situation to help cover her expenses. However, Sydney told the school administration that her family already knew and did not need to be contacted. This was not true, and she was afraid that her parents would find out about her expulsion. During this time, she told her parents that she was doing well in school and had good grades, and that she had even won a scholarship. Her parents trusted her and had no reason to doubt her. After being evicted from campus, Sydney left but did not return home before the end of February. Instead, she stayed with friends in various hotels, paying in cash to avoid being tracked and to keep her situation at the university a secret. Although she worked part-time to support herself, her earnings were insufficient. Sydney constantly searched for online opportunities to make money, but could not find a full-time job that would provide adequate support. She continued to live in hotels or with friends, afraid to go home. She kept back on everything and often did not eat enough. Eventually, she decided to return home, claiming that the campus was closed for renovations. She told her parents that she would stay with them while she went to college and still work. Her parents believed her and thought everything was fine. Sydney has been lying to her mother by saying that she is fine. Recently, Brenda has noticed some strange changes in her daughter's behavior. She discovers that Sydney is spending more time at home and not going to school, which raises concerns. This information later comes to light because Sydney's entire family uses the Life 360 app, a mobile phone location tracking app on a map for safety, allowing family members to know where each other are. On February 25, 2020, Brenda received a notification from the app that Sydney had stayed home all day instead of coming to college as scheduled. This worried Brenda, who was concerned that something was wrong. She contacted her daughter to find out what was going on. Sydney replied that she had a week off because her teacher was absent. She mentioned that students were given assignments to complete at home and were participating in remote learning. However, Brenda began to doubt Sydney's story. She told her daughter that her explanations did not seem right and reminded her of the importance of good grades to maintain her scholarship and graduate, which would affect her future job opportunities. She also emphasized the importance of attending school regularly. Sydney then reassured her mother that everything was fine and that she should not worry. The deception continued. On March 2nd, Sydney texted her mother, saying she was going to school and would be back by 2:30 p.m. Instead, she spent time with a friend, watching TV, while lying about her college situation. During this time, the parents noticed that something was wrong. Their daughter did not receive the scholarship, so her father, Stephen, had to pay her tuition. He tried to send money through the payment gateway, but could not complete the transaction because he had lost access to his account. Initially, he suspected a technical problem and decided to wait. However, when Stephen logged in on March 3rd while working at a metallurgical plant, he was still unable to complete the transaction. He then asked his daughter about the problem. Sydney reassured him not to worry and promised that she would look into the matter and resolve it. The Stephen realized he could not delay any longer as the deadline was near, and he needed to pay for his daughter's studies quickly. He decided to contact the university himself to resolve the situation. When he called, the staff checked their records and informed him that Sydney was not listed as a student, meaning her access had been revoked. The Stephen was shocked and thought there must be some mistake. He requested they verify the information again, and they confirmed that Sydney had indeed been expelled. However, the university staff would not disclose the date of her expulsion. Citing confidentiality rules, the Stephen used a tracking app to locate Sydney, who was supposed to be in class. Instead, he discovered she was at home while he was at work. He wanted to go home to talk to her, but he feared she might track his movements and run away. To avoid this, he left his phone at work and headed home. Before leaving, he called Sydney to gather information, but she avoided giving clear answers. During the conversation, she admitted that she was struggling at university and didn't like it there. However, she continued to lie, not confessing that she had been expelled a long time ago. Instead, she claimed she had just not been attending classes. Stephen was troubled by his daughter's situation. He believed she was capable and had a bright future ahead, but he worried that her lack of commitment to attending classes could hinder her progress. He wanted to talk to her about the issue, so they could find a solution together. On his way to work, Stephen called Brenda to inform her about their daughter's learning difficulties. Although Brenda suspected something was wrong, she hoped it was not true. Throughout the call, Stephen was concerned about Sydney's situation. However, Brenda reassured him. With a background in psychology, she had a skill for helping others and wanted to use her experience to support their daughter. She promised Stephen that she would take time off work, go home, and have a calm and open discussion with Sydney to ensure that they could all make the best decision together. Brenda then tried to contact the school, but was unsuccessful. She left a voicemail asking for a call back and then went home. When Brenda reached her private entrance, she told her husband what had happened and went inside. Meanwhile, teachers Michelle and John received Brenda's message and called her back within the hour. At approximately 12:36 p.m., Brenda answered the phone and spoke calmly to the teachers. Everything seemed normal until Brenda started screaming into the phone, followed by a series of noises. Michelle and John, who were listening on speakerphone, were confused about what was but sensed that something was wrong. Michelle and John were worried about what had happened and tried calling Brenda again, but she did not answer. After several tries, a woman finally picked up at 12:40 p.m., but it wasn't Brenda. The teachers recognized Sydney's voice and asked to speak to her mother, but the call suddenly ended. This situation made Michelle and John suspicious. They decided to contact the local police to check on Brenda. Police officer Kenneth Diss, a friend of Brenda's family, heard the call and was extremely concerned about the alarming situation. He personally called Stephen to ask what was going on at their house, but Stephen could not provide any information because he was not home. After thinking for a moment, Stephen recalled that Sydney and Brenda were supposed to be at home discussing their study problems. He suspected there might have been a conflict between his wife and daughter, but he couldn't imagine the reality of the situation. Stephen then rushed home and called his daughter, Sydney, to find out what was going on. Sydney reassures him that everything is fine and the atmosphere seems calm. However, when Stephen tells her that the police are on their way, Sydney suddenly becomes hysterical. She begins to cry and reveals that a robber has broken into the house and attacked them. The call then ends abruptly. The police had already arrived at the house when Sydney dashed out, covered in blood and screaming. She told the officers a shocking story about a robber who had broken in and attacked her mother. She said she heard glass breaking and that her mother told her to run, so she did. Sydney then hid in a courtyard, anxiously listening. She then found her mother lying in a pool of blood, and she tried to help her, which is how she got blood on her. Inside the house, officers found Brenda lying face up in a room. She was badly injured, with a bloody cast-iron skillet nearby and a kitchen knife on the floor. Despite the broken glass, officers began to doubt Sydney's story. Her story about a robber seemed very unbelievable. An ambulance arrived quickly and took Brenda to hospital, where she was taken to the intensive care unit. Sadly, 50-year-old Brenda Powell died shortly after arriving. Sydney was also examined by paramedics, but no serious injuries were found. She was sedated, her cuts were bandaged, and she was sent home. Forensic experts who examined Brenda's body were shocked by the brutality of the attack. She had suffered a severe blow to the back of the head, which caused her scalp to detach from her skull. Additionally, she had numerous stab wounds, estimated to be between 20 and 30, mostly concentrated on her neck. There were also multiple bruises and cuts on her arms, suggesting she had tried to defend herself. A preliminary review of the situation led police to believe that Sydney's account of events was fabricated. Although Sydney was covered in blood and had several smaller cuts on her arms, they were significantly less severe than her mother's injuries. It was evident that the robbery had been staged, as nothing was taken from the house. Sydney's actions raised several questions. After her mother told her to leave the house, why didn't she run to the neighbors for help or call 911? Instead, she waited in the yard and later went back into the house without any apparent fear. None of the neighbors reported seeing a robber. The blood found on Sydney was tested and matched her mother's, including traces on the broken glass. Police sent the knife, believed to be the murder weapon, and the frying pan for analysis. Brenda's blood was found on these items, and no fingerprints or other DNA were found at the scene. It appears that Sydney injured herself when she stabbed her mother. Sydney Powell was then taken to the police station for questioning. After the initial panic subsided, she refused to answer any questions. By this time, police investigating the attack had learned about recent events in Sydney's university life. They discovered that she had been expelled a month earlier and had lied to her family about her situation, staying with friends in hotels instead. She was so afraid of disappointing those around her that she had lied not only to her parents but also to her classmates and others. Police believed that Sydney was so afraid of telling the truth that she decided to kill her mother when her mother started to suspect something was wrong. Despite this, Sydney chose to remain silent. 19-year-old Sydney Powell was arrested and charged with murdering Brenda. She also faced charges for causing serious injury and for tampering with evidence to mislead the investigation. Due to her mental health issues, she was unable to admit or deny her guilt. Her lawyer argued that she was insane, stating that Sydney had struggled with serious mental health problems since childhood. At the time of the offense, Sydney may have been experiencing a mental health crisis that affected her perception of her actions. Sydney faced several mental health issues that may have contributed to the violent incident, which led police to request a psychiatric evaluation. During the examination, Sydney spoke about her memories of that day, but could only recall bits and pieces. She remembered sitting in the basement, anxious about her parents coming home after her father found out about her struggles. She also remembers her mother coming home and their conversation starting, when her mother comforted her and asked what happened at school. She wished her mother would leave her alone. Then she heard the sound of glass breaking, and then she couldn't remember anything else about what happened. Sydney informed her doctor that she had been experiencing hallucinations since she was 11 years old. She had always been very anxious, responsible, and self-critical, setting extremely high academic standards for herself. At times her anxiety became so intense that it affected her ability to concentrate on tests, leading to multiple psychological evaluations. After extensive evaluation and discussion with Sydney, the psychiatrist diagnosed her with acute post-traumatic stress disorder, schizoaffective disorder, and depression. Sydney reported that she had recurring nightmares of her mother covered in blood. The lack of a clear motive for the murder led the psychiatrist to determine that Sydney was insane at the time of the incident. Another doctor who worked with Sydney for at least 3 to 6 months before the crime noted that her mental health had deteriorated significantly. She started losing touch with reality and began failing her exams, which ultimately led to her expulsion from university. Her condition was worsened by extreme self-criticism. She couldn't accept that she had failed. Sydney was also afraid to confess her struggles to her parents. However, the truth eventually came out, causing her immense stress. This culminated in a psychotic breakdown that resulted in her mother's murder. After her arrest, Sydney's bail was initially set at $250,000, but was later raised to $500,000. One of her relatives posted bail, allowing her to await her trial outside of custody. During this time, she received treatment for her mental health issues and felt significantly better by the time the hearings began. Sydney eventually regained her composure. After Sydney saw Brenda talking to college teachers, she knew that her mother would soon hear the truth from them. In a psychotic state, she attacked her mother. Teachers at the college heard the beginning of the attack. During the trial, her friends and relatives confirmed that they did not notice any significant changes in her behavior leading up to the crime. Although she was upset about being expelled, she was generally cheerful and sociable. The only noticeable difference was that she began sleeping more. The defense acknowledged that Sydney killed her mother, but maintained that she was insane at the time. However, many experts disagreed with the psychiatrist's diagnosis. What everyone agreed on was that she suffered from borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by stubbornness, mood swings, and self-destructive behavior. In addition, signs of hallucinations were reported by Sydney to a psychiatrist when she was 11. There was no evidence in the medical records to support Sydney's claims, which undermined the defense's strategy. Several former friends mentioned that Sydney had exhibited unusual behavior even during her school years. One teacher recalled when Sydney was so nervous that she couldn't read anything on a test. However, teacher didn't realize that Sydney's anxiety could indicate mental health issues, so teacher didn't tell anyone. This type of anxiety continued into college, which may have contributed to Sydney failing her exams and eventually being expelled. While awaiting trial, Sydney lived with her grandmother and was prescribed medication to treat her mental health issues. The medication list and dosage were changed several times to find the most effective combination. Sydney's health improved significantly, and she shared any positive changes with her doctor. Her father also noticed the improvement and admitted that Sydney had a strong bond with her mother and loved her deeply. He believed that if Sydney had been in a healthy state of mind, she would never have harmed her mother. Throughout the trial, Sydney cried continuously and she expressed remorse for her actions. On September 18, 2023, the jury deliberated. Sydney Powell was found guilty on all counts. Sydney was sentenced to life in prison, but will be eligible for parole after 15 years. Sydney and her attorney were unhappy with the sentence and planned to appeal the court's decision. Case 3. The case of Christopher Sutton. On Sunday, August 22, 2004, the Sutton family experienced a devastating tragedy following Susan's 57th birthday celebration. The celebration included Susan, her husband John, their son Christopher, his girlfriend Juliet, and family friend Teddy Montota. After the party, Susan and John went to bed in separate rooms at their home in the upscale Coral Gables neighborhood near Miami, Florida. One night, a tragic event occurred. Susan usually slept in a separate room because her husband, John, snored loudly. While they were sleeping, a car stopped about 4 blocks away from their house. A man dressed in black was approaching their house with the intention of killing Susan and John. The attacker was armed with a 9mm Glock pistol and broke into Susan's house. He first went to John's bedroom and shot him twice in the head. He then moved to the room where Susan was sleeping, shot her 6 times, and left. The police were notified of the incident. Police and ambulances were dispatched to the scene shortly afterwards. Unfortunately, doctors determined that Susan, 57, had died. John was still alive but had suffered serious injuries and had lost a lot of blood. He was taken to hospital, where paramedics worked frantically to save him, although his chances of survival were slim. Before being taken to hospital, John said that he could not see the shooter in the dark and did not know who it was. Forensic experts began examining the crime scene while police questioned neighbors and searched for surveillance cameras. Although no cameras were found, but neighbors reported seeing a suspicious man dressed in dark clothing running away from the house. There were no signs of forced entry. The killer had accessed the home through the sliding glass doors. The house was intact, with no money or jewelry taken, indicating to police that this was not a robbery. The attack was clearly targeted at killing Susan and John, but the motive behind the murder remains unknown. Melissa Sutton was 18 years old when her parents were attacked. As a freshman living on her own, she couldn't attend the celebration at their house. She was devastated to learn about her mother's death. Overwhelmed with grief, she went to see her father in the hospital. She described him as looking very unwell. John had miraculously survived 2 gunshot wounds to the head, leaving doctors astonished that he was still alive, although he remained in serious condition. When John woke up in intensive care, he realized he was blind. Additionally, he was experiencing severe shock. He felt unsafe in the hospital, constantly fearing that the killer might return. This left John feeling endangered. He was eager to leave the hospital and find a safe place to hide. His fears were taken seriously, so a guard was assigned to his room, and police patrolled the area around the clock. Due to the severity of his injuries, John was also unable to hear anything. He didn't hear the shots fired at his wife, and was unaware of what happened to Susan. As he slowly started to recover, he asked Melissa how his wife was. She did not answer because the police had advised her not to say anything that might upset John further. He later found out that his wife had been murdered by her attacker. The news was a huge shock to him. Susan's death was a huge loss for the whole family. She had devoted her life to being a loving mother. Susan spent many years as an intensive care nurse, a respected profession in the United States. Her career ended in the late 1970s when she decided to stay at home with her husband, John, after the birth of their first child, Christopher. They made this choice because Susan had been unable to conceive for 7 years, at which point they decided to adopt a daughter, Melissa. The police discovered that John had built a successful business and may have had enemies. They also learned that he had received previous threats of violence. The police investigated everyone who had had animosity toward John and Susan, but they all had solid alibis. While the police searched the crime scene for evidence, they discovered that Susan's purse, jewelry belonging to her or her husband, were still intact, although these items were visible. The police planned to interview John, but he had difficulty communicating. However, he was able to provide some useful information. Although he could not identify the shooter, he recalled seeing a dark figure at the door. The attacker may have been dressed all in black, or may have been African American. John could not be certain in the darkness. Unfortunately, This information was not useful to the police. The police decided to speak with Teddy, a family friend who was at the party before the shooting. They visited his house for an interview. Teddy explained that he was on the phone with Susan at the exact moment the shooting happened. He heard a gunshot, followed by silence. Feeling frightened, he called the police, got into his car and rushed to the Susan family's home, arriving just after the police. Teddy was very shaken by the attack on Susan. However, the police found his account unusual. They questioned why he was still talking to Susan when everyone else had already left the party, leading them to suspect an affair. Teddy clarified that he was not just a family friend, but also a business partner. He claimed that they were discussing an urgent business matter, and that he frequently communicated with both John and Susan to handle various issues, so he didn't find his late conversation with Susan abnormal. During the conversation, Teddy told the police that the shooters were professional and trained shooters. The police found this information interesting and took Teddy's gun for testing. Teddy was also called into the station for a lie detector test. The police believed he was hiding something and continued to question him. Teddy eventually confessed that he was in a romantic relationship with Susan. The police have often seen love triangles that can lead people to commit terrible acts. However, Teddy's gun did not match the weapon used in the attack, and his phone was tracked to a location far from the crime scene at the time of the shooting. Teddy denied any involvement in the attack on John and Susan. Although his lie detector test was deemed inconclusive, it was suggested that his anxiety stemmed from trying to keep his affair with Susan a secret to avoid damaging his relationship with his friend John. John had a strong and trusting relationship with Teddy. Shortly before the incident, John and Teddy received one of the largest payouts in their law firm's history, over $1 million, and they celebrated this occasion extravagantly. Teddy was ruled out as a suspect, and the police decided to investigate other family members instead. An examination revealed that John could not have physically inflicted the shot on himself, so he was not considered a suspect. Their daughter Melissa has a solid alibi because she was in another city and also passed a lie detector test. The police then investigated Christopher Sutton. He had a girlfriend named Juliet. They had attended a family party together. Christopher quickly claimed that he and Juliet had gone to the movies the night before and provided their tickets as evidence. Juliet confirmed his story. The police then requested the cinema surveillance camera footage, confirming that they had indeed gone to the cinema that night and confirming their alibi. After leaving the hospital, John moved in with Christopher so he could care for him for a while. However, disturbing evidence was discovered that Christopher actually wanted to kill his parents. He even threatened to kill his mother during a fight. Christopher became the prime suspect in the case. Additionally, Christopher had a criminal record that included vandalizing a teacher's home. When Christopher was 16, his parents, John and Susan, decided to send him to a reform school. Christopher was aggressive and had trouble controlling his anger, which made it difficult for him to socialize with other teenagers. He changed schools at least 6 times. He often skipped school. John would drop him off at the main entrance, walk to the door, but then Christopher would sneak out through another exit and go do his own thing. However, his absences were not his biggest problem. He also got involved in some criminal activities. One day, he and a group of friends broke into a teacher's house, causing damage and graffiti. As a result, Christopher was arrested, and the teacher filed a lawsuit against him. The damage was estimated to be in excess of $50,000, and his parents had to pay it. Christopher's family had no financial problems and could easily pay the fine. However, his family was frustrated with their son's out-of-control behavior and did not know how to handle him. Christopher was a difficult teenager who had no respect for adult authority. His rebellion began with his love of piercings and tattoos, which his parents strongly disapproved of. Despite their efforts, they were unable to change his behavior, which led to more problems. One day, Christopher pointed an unloaded rifle at his mother and sister, threatening to kill them. Shortly before Christopher's 16th birthday, Susan discovered a note in his room that outlined a plan to kill his parents to inherit their money. Susan informed John about the note, and they confronted Christopher, who dismissed it as a joke. However, when his parents saw the note, they became frightened. From that point on, they were afraid to be alone with their son in the house. They even sought legal help, which led to a court-ordered rehabilitation program. Staff from a specialist organization forcibly transferred Christopher to a rehabilitation facility on the island of Samoa called Paradise Bay. It is a strict school for troubled youth. In 1998, when Christopher first arrived at this institution, his behavior became extremely aggressive, leading to him being restrained. Following this, he was taken to a remote camp in the mountains, where he was left tied up. The staff aimed to re-educate him through these strict measures. Typically, such severe discipline was effective and helped even the most challenging cases to improve. After spending a year in a behavior correction facility, Christopher sent his parents an emotional video message. In it, he described the violence he experienced there and accused his parents of not loving him for sending him to such a place. Upon hearing this, his parents visited institutions for troubled teenagers in Samoa, but found nothing wrong. As a result, they did not believe Christopher's claims. They knew about the strict rules in place and believed they were intended to benefit troubled teens. Furthermore, Christopher was there under a court order, so his parents could not take him away. However, Christopher still hoped to leave the facility when he turned 18. John then received a court order stating that Christopher would remain in custody. The program at Paradise Bay was extended for another year, which surprised Christopher. But he had no choice but to remain at the facility. In 2000, Paradise Bay was closed after management faced multiple allegations of youth mistreatment. Christopher finally returned home on his 19th birthday, after 30 months at Paradise Bay. This situation raised concerns for the police, as his anger at being mistreated could be considered a motive for murder. After enduring such torture, Christopher may have felt the urge to take revenge on his parents. However, after returning from Paradise Bay, he changed. Christopher always showed that he had become a caring and calm son, especially in how he took care of his father following an incident. John could not believe that his son could be involved in the case, believing that Christopher had changed. However, the police suspected that Christopher had orchestrated the double murder, which was only partially successful because his father survived. Although Christopher had an alibi, he may have hired someone else to carry out the crime. The police needed to gather evidence to support their suspicions, so they brought him in for a second interview. In this conversation, Christopher reveals details that have not been revealed to the public and remain confidential. Christopher said he went to the scene of the incident. He saw the shooter walking down the hallway, and his mother Susan had been shot 6 times, information that was later confirmed during the investigation. Christopher also recounted the order in which the shots were fired and other key details. While Christopher appears distraught and cries over his mother's death, the police believe he is lying and is actually a criminal. However, Christopher was supported by his girlfriend Juliet, who also seemed shocked by the incident. She said she herself had been in shock for a long time, following the news of the shooting. Juliet met Christopher when she was 17 and he was 19, having just returned from a school for troubled youth. She described him as kind, polite, and courteous, and he made a strong positive impression on her. He treated her like a true gentleman, so she could never imagine that he could commit murder. Juliet said that his parents welcomed her into their family. His mother, Susan, taught her how to apply makeup and helped her develop her dressing style. His father, John, also supported her by giving her a job at his law firm. The couple's parents supported them financially without expecting anything in return. They were happy to see the couple together. When police first encountered Christopher at the crime scene, it was shortly after he had been informed of the incident. He appeared to be very upset, and one officer noticed tears on his face. However, his initial statement to police during questioning shattered the impression of sadness. He quickly explained that he and Juliet had had dinner with their parents, but left at around 9 p.m. to go to the movies. He then gave the police their movie tickets. Instead of asking how he's doing, he focused on justifying his actions and emphasized his alibi before any charges were brought. Police carefully reviewed surveillance footage from the cinema, which showed Christopher leaving after the movie around midnight. They noticed he immediately used his mobile phone to make a call, arousing curiosity about who he was contacting. The police quickly checked all his calls. Police later determined that Christopher had contacted a man named Garrett Kopp 331 times in the days leading up to the murder, which raised suspicions. Garrett, a police officer with a criminal record, had come to the attention of police. They suspected he might be involved in the crime. The case drew attention to Garrett's troubled past, including multiple arrests, adding to police suspicions. Police began to consider Garrett as a potential suspect. At the time of the case, he was out on bail. When police examined the weapon used in the murder, they found it to be very similar to Garrett's Glock, so he was taken to the station for questioning. Garrett had a tense conversation with the police and later admitted to attacking John and Susan. However, Garrett insisted that he did not act on his own. He said that Christopher had threatened to kill him and his son if he did not comply. Garrett insisted that the idea for the attack was entirely Christopher's. He also said that Christopher had given him the gun and had left the door unlocked, allowing him easy access to the house. The police arrested Garrett and charged him with murder, but his testimony was not enough to keep Christopher in custody. Juliet was questioned by police who believed she had more information than she was revealing. Despite their efforts, she denied any involvement and insisted on her innocence for several hours. The interrogation lasted 13 hours in total, but the police did not record it. Later, Juliet alleged that police had threatened her with arrest to force a confession and acted provocatively during the questioning. However, she eventually admitted that Christopher felt a strong resentment towards his parents for placing him in a facility for troubled teenagers. Recently, his parents tried to push him to get a job and start covering his own costs, which he found unacceptable, and this led to family conflicts. During questioning, Juliet revealed that Christopher had been planning revenge on his parents for years. He often spoke about the inheritance and how they could live without worries if he could take everything his parents had earned. However, she didn't take his threats seriously. The police had gathered enough evidence to obtain an arrest warrant for Christopher Sutton. However, by that time, he had disappeared. This was a crucial moment for the police, as they feared that Christopher might return to harm John. Fortunately, the police were able to locate and arrest Christopher, charging him with the murder of his mother and attempted murder of his father. Garrett Kopp and Christopher Sutton were eventually tried separately, and both faced the death penalty. Christopher, however, maintained that he had no role in planning the crime. The defense argued that the police were unfair, claiming that the police pressured Juliet, which influenced her testimony. After Garrett learned that he could face the death penalty, Garrett decided to cooperate with the prosecution by pleading guilty to a lesser charge, which was in his favor. He was then sentenced to 30 years in prison. The prosecution's case took a turn when Juliet appeared in court to testify. She revealed that Christopher had often expressed anger at his parents for not giving him money, even saying that they deserved to die for their actions. The defense argued that much of Juliet's testimony was given under police pressure and should be excluded from the case. However, the judge denied this request. In court, Juliet maintained that she had been truthful during her interrogation with the police. She stated that she viewed Christopher's anger as mere frustration and never believed he would go on to commit such serious crimes. After Juliet's testimony, John, the surviving father, shared his thoughts. After hearing all the witness testimony, John believed that Christopher was capable of committing the crime. John noted that even after leaving the hospital, Christopher continued to try to manage the family's finances, which led him to believe that Christopher was involved in the crime. When it was Christopher's turn to speak, he accused Garrett of attacking their parents due to his drug addiction. Christopher highlighted several moments when Garrett was out of control due to drugs, claiming that during those times he was dangerous and capable of committing any crime. Christopher also mentioned that he kept drugs in Susan's bedroom closet. The Garrett might have entered the house to steal illegal drugs. However, the prosecutor argued that the scene did not appear to be a burglary. Everything was intact. Even the money and jewelry were intact. If it was a burglary, Garrett would have taken valuables. In his defense, Christopher claimed that he had changed and overcome the anger, resentment, and disappointment he felt towards his parents for sending him to a special school. He believed that he had changed for the better. After extensive deliberation, the jury found Christopher Sutton guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. Christopher was shocked by the verdict because he was sure that he would be acquitted. Christopher received 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Currently, survivor John Sutton is putting in great effort to regain his eyesight. He has formed a new relationship and started a family, and at 70 years old, he continues to practice law. Case 4. In the small town of Jamestown, California, Daniel Mark Driver was on trial for child abuse. One of Daniel's victims was William Nelia, a defenseless child. William's mother, Ellie, felt that the justice system had failed to protect her son, so Ellie took matters into her own hands with a gun. The case sparked widespread debate, with some people fully supporting Ellie, while others criticized her actions. Ultimately, the discussion surrounding the case attracted national attention. Jamestown was a small, quiet town with a population of about 3,500 at the time of the incident. Ellie was the eldest of 3 daughters. Her parents were hardworking miners who taught Ellie the importance of self-reliance from a young age. As a result, She grew up to be strong and independent. During her teenage years, Ellie began to help her family by looking for work. It was a tough economic time. She took on various jobs to supplement her income. She also helped her parents by taking care of her younger siblings. When Ellie turned 20, she fell in love with a guy she met, and they quickly entered a romantic relationship. Soon after, they got married, but their marriage ended in divorce shortly thereafter. Her next partner was Bill, who worked as a miner. Additionally, Bill operated construction equipment, allowing him to earn a good income. They married in 1982 and soon welcomed a son named William. Bill grew up in an area that was once the center of the gold rush. As a child, he had listened to stories of old men panning for gold in the river, which inspired him to seek their adventure, even though the land was largely depleted by then. In search of better fortune, Bill and his family traveled to Liberia, West Africa, during the gold rush. While Bill was prospecting for gold, Ellie gave birth to their daughter, Rebecca. Unfortunately, Rebecca's early years were not peaceful. Suddenly, shortly after her birth, civil war broke out in Liberia. As a result, Ellie and the children returned to Jamestown, while Bill remained in West Africa, determined to make his fortune mining gold. During this time, Ellie faced numerous challenges in the United States. She received no support from Bill, and although she was a strong and independent woman, managing a household and caring for 2 young children proved to be very difficult for her. They relied on government assistance and occasional jobs that Ellie managed to find. During this period, she received support from her family and the church, which she attended regularly with her children and sister. Her mother often advised her to be self-reliant, but also to carry a gun in her handbag for protection. Ellie took this lesson to heart. Despite her delicate appearance, she was always prepared to defend herself and, if needed, to take the initiative in a confrontation. This aspect of her character would later lead to tragic consequences. Ellie is very close to her children and does not let them go far. This protectiveness stems from her own traumatic experience as a child, when she was molested by an adult man. After she confided in her mother reacted violently and threatened him to leave town. This incident left Ellie with lasting psychological scars that she has struggled with throughout her life. She fears that her children may face similar dangers. When her son William went to summer camp away from home, she felt very anxious and scared. Despite her worries, William kept asking his mother to let him go to the summer camp organized by the church. Ellie was very anxious about letting her son spend time with others without her supervision. She hadn't even allowed him to sleep over at friends' houses. Eventually, her sister Jenna reassured her, explaining that she knew the camp organizers well and described them as respectable and good people. After thinking it over, Ellie finally agreed to let her son go, hoping he would enjoy himself. William spent 3 weeks at a church-run tent camp. After returning from the summer camp, Ellie noticed a change in William's behavior. William became aggressive, often sad, and stopped communicating. Ellie sensed that something was bothering him. Despite her and her family's efforts to find out what was happening at the camp, William refused to discuss it with adults. He insisted on being treated like an adult and wanted them to stop asking him questions. Younger sister Rebecca and his mother thought he was trying to imitate the older teenagers he had met at the camp. When the new school year started a few weeks later, everyone thought William was settling in well with his friends. However, when he returned to class, things did not improve. He began to withdraw from his family and became aggressive with his classmates, rarely interacting with others. His anger often became uncontrollable, and these incidents had increased since he had been at the camp. Ellie was confused by William's changes, and it took her over a year to discover the reason behind them. Unfortunately, the truth behind it was quite heartbreaking. Daniel Mark Driver, a 30-year-old man who attended the same church as Ellie and her children, had recently moved in with his mother, who lived nearby. He was considered a good man and an active member of the church, known for his community involvement and willingness to help other parishioners. He always carried a Bible with him and could easily recite passages from it. Daniel took on the role of kitchen staff at the summer camp and also helped supervise the children, who always spoke positively of him. He is a natural psychologist. According to his parents, Daniel can help solve any difficult situation. Students often come to him to confide in him when they are in trouble. Many boys who do not have fathers consider Daniel as a father figure. With his persuasive skills, he can talk to any teenager. William experienced a significant change in his relationship with Daniel. William used to enjoy spending time with Daniel and interacting with him. But after returning from summer camp, William became noticeably anxious even during casual encounters. During this time, William often argued with his sister Rebecca, seemingly starting conflicts for no reason, and William also began to defy his mother. He had never argued with Ellie before, but now he became increasingly defiant. Occasionally, William's Aunt Jen, who was very close to the family, would take William to her home for the weekend. This gave his mother a break. About 9 months after the camp, Jen took William to her home for a weekend. During his stay, he had the opportunity to spend time with his cousins. Each time, Jen tried to discuss the major changes in his behavior, but William was quiet and avoided answering her questions. However, he later confided in her a secret, insisting that she not tell anyone, not even his mother. Jen agreed to keep it a secret. 7-year-old William shared his experience while he was at summer camp. Daniel began to behave inappropriately towards him. One day, the Daniel lured William into the woods with the promise of showing him frogs and other animals. However, as they went deeper into the woods, the Daniel began to abuse him. This abuse continued regularly, even after the summer camp ended. The boy was afraid to go to church and tried to avoid the Daniel as much as possible. The abuse began when William was 6 years old, and during this time, the Daniel threatened him, saying that he would harm William and his family if he revealed what was happening. Fearing danger to his loved ones, William kept quiet, and the abuse continued for many months. After hearing the story, Jen felt she had to talk to Ellie. She apologized to William for revealing his secret, but felt the need to take action against the rapist and put an end to his actions. Jen first spoke to her sister Ellie about what had happened to William. Ellie was shocked and blamed herself for exposing her child to such a problem. From the beginning, her maternal instincts warned her that William should not attend the camp. However, she succumbed to the pressure, leading to the outcome she feared and experienced. William worried that the man might come back and act on his threat if he found out that William had told anyone about the incident. The boy became increasingly anxious and fearful. He often came home from school in tears, telling his mother that he had seen Daniel's car in the distance. The panic attacks became more frequent, and he began to feel paranoid. He tried his best to cope, but the situation was still not good. Ellie then reported the molestation involving their son to the police. Police checked Daniel's record in a national database, discovering a worrying history of crimes involving children. In 1984, he was charged with indecent exposure to 5 boys in the San Jose area. Although he was arrested, his church community sent letters of support to him before the trial. With no solid evidence other than the boys' testimony, the judge ultimately decided to give Daniel probation instead of a prison sentence, allowing him to escape the consequences of his actions. This leniency allowed him to continue his harmful actions. Daniel then decided to move away and start over. He moved closer to his mother, where no one knew about his past crimes. Daniel also started attending church and developed a healthy relationship with a woman who had a young son. He became more involved with the children, working with them, giving them advice, and eventually got a job at a church summer camp, where he was often around children. However, the woman began to notice Daniel's unusual behavior towards her child and started to pay closer attention. She eventually asked her son if Daniel had ever bothered him, but the boy appeared confused and insisted that nothing inappropriate had happened. The mother, doubting her son's honesty and fearing he was too scared to speak up, did not dismiss her concerns. She continued to monitor Daniel's behavior. A few months later, she caught Daniel molesting her son. She then contacted a friend who was the district attorney. A background check revealed that Daniel had served 5 months in 1983 for child abuse. Concerns about him grew when William's case occurred, prompting the boy's mother, Ellie, to contact the police. At that point, the police investigated Daniel more closely and gathered evidence from new victims of his molestation. After Ellie reported the incident, the police stepped up their efforts to prevent similar crimes by Daniel. Police began questioning all the families who had come into contact with Daniel, including children who had attended the camp. Many of them reported similar experiences, which helped police understand the tactics Daniel used. He repeatedly targeted boys, gaining their trust while threatening to kill them and their families if they spoke out, which proved effective. Police identified 5 new victims in the area, including William. In 1983, charges were filed, but they were unable to arrest Daniel because he had been out of town for an extended period of time. At the time, it was difficult to track his whereabouts due to the lack of cell phones, GPS, and other tracking technology. Police suspected that he had learned of the investigation and had gone into hiding. Both Daniel and his car were placed on the wanted list, and his photo was widely circulated in the press. However, despite these efforts, it took several years to find him. Meanwhile, William's depression and aggressive behavior continued. He frequently got into fights at school, did poorly in school, and became, as a result, William was expelled from several schools and transferred several times. Ellie believes her son's behavior stems from past violence that has deeply affected him. She sought help for her son, taking him to numerous doctors and psychologists in hopes of improving his situation, but nothing seemed to work. In 1993, police finally caught up with Daniel at a store in Palo Alto, California, for shoplifting. After confessing to the theft, Daniel faced charges not only for shoplifting, but also for child abuse. Even after Daniel was arrested and awaiting trial, William continued to feel afraid. He struggled to accept that he would have to face his abuser in court. William would have to testify against him, but the thought of it filled him with dread. William was so anxious that the mere mention of the trial made him feel sick. In desperation, Ellie approached the prosecutor to request special arrangements for her son's testimony. She hoped William could testify without Daniel present to spare him serious emotional distress. Unfortunately, the current rules required William to appear before a jury. To address this situation, the only solution was to install cameras, so that the William could provide testimony from another room. He would be recorded, and the video would be shown in court. Unfortunately, the small community lacked the funds to set this up. As a result, William had to appear in court like the other boys who had also been victimized by the Daniel. The trial was challenging due to the presence of many emotionally and physically traumatized children. The boys who had already testified had experienced significant distress, but they managed to get through it. On April 2, 1993, 11-year-old William was one of the last witnesses to take the stand. Ellie tried to prepare him for his meeting with Daniel the criminal as best she could. However, when the car carrying William and his relatives arrived at the courthouse, William did not want to leave. He began to have a panic attack and vomited violently. Ellie reassured him that he needed to testify, because testifying was the only way to ensure that a dangerous person would be locked up and unable to harm anyone else. William understood the importance of his testimony, but his fear made it difficult for him to calm down. Ellie, William, and the aunts waited outside the courthouse to be called to testify. During this time, they tried to comfort William and help him calm down. Suddenly, a van arrived at the courthouse and Daniel was taken out. When William saw Daniel, he felt nauseous again. Ellie stared at Daniel as he walked through the courthouse yard. She later remembered that Daniel just smirked and walked past. She felt a burning hatred for this man. As they left the building, Daniel's ex-girlfriend and her son, who was also a victim, testified against him. The woman told Ellie that things were not going well. She noted that the children were nervous and confused in their testimony. Daniel took advantage of this by highlighting inconsistencies in their testimony. He continued to put the children in difficult situations, asking distressing questions that only made them more confused. They became increasingly upset, some of them crying. This makes Ellie worried about William. Ellie fears that the situation could affect the trial, potentially allowing a dangerous criminal to escape justice and return to his former criminal ways. At that moment, Ellie Nessler suddenly realizes that she must serve justice, and Daniel must be stopped forever. Court in this county lack modern security features like metal detectors. It is easy to carry guns inside, and many people in the community, including Jen, carry weapons for self-defense. While on the street, Ellie reached into her purse and quietly pulled out a gun. She hid the weapon as they entered the courtroom, where Ellie shot Daniel 6 times. 5 of the bullets hit him in the back of the head and neck, killing him instantly. People in the courtroom panicked and fled, and police rushed in with loaded guns. Jen stepped in front of her sister, causing Ellie to throw the gun to the ground and raise her hands in surrender. She was then arrested. The shocking story of a mother staging a lynching during a hearing quickly made national headlines. Within a week, every major media outlet had covered the incident, sparking widespread debate about the lynching. Many saw Ellie as a hero, receiving overwhelming support from local residents, especially those affected by the event. 2 local banks even set up defense funds that the community could contribute to for Ellie, leading to a rush of donations from her supporters. Items such as t-shirts that read "Good Shot Ellie" became popular and which sold well. Similar stickers could be found on cars all over the country. Despite this, Ellie couldn't be celebrated as a national hero for her actions. She was arrested and had a bail set at $500,000. This amount was provided by a guarantor from Simon, allowing her to return home before the hearings and await trial in her own community. However, not everyone agreed with her decision, and she faced criticism from some members of society who accused her of taking the law into her own hands. Still, the majority, including the local community, viewed her as a protector of her child. Police uncovered additional details about Ellie's situation. They found that she had been under the influence of illegal drugs when she fired her weapon in the courthouse. Ellie claimed she used these substances to give herself the courage needed to endure the stressful courtroom hearings. In October 1993, she received a diagnosis of breast cancer, with doctors estimating she only had 5 years to live. Initially found guilty of manslaughter, Ellie was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, her conviction was later overturned due to the jury's misconduct. She then reached a plea deal with the prosecution, admitting guilt to manslaughter, and ultimately served 3 years in prison before her release. William then moved in with his Aunt Jen. After 2 years, he was finally able to communicate with Ellie, who was still serving her sentence in prison. Ellie expressed her feelings. She deeply regretted having to take someone's life, which was never her intention. However, she felt that the justice system would not be able to protect her son and other children from a dangerous criminal. The only reason she pulled the trigger was the fear that Daniel would be released again. William's life was ruined at a key moment in his growing up. He was molested and then dragged through the courts. William became a hooligan, got involved with bad company, and lost his way. As a result, he had frequent encounters with the law, with courts and prison becoming a regular part of his life. He was first charged with a crime at the age of 14. He was incarcerated 18 times between 1999 and 2004 for various crimes. His criminal record was extensive, including charges of robbery, assault, illegal possession of a weapon, and drug-related offenses. In 2004, when he turned 23, William was living freely, had several tattoos, and resided in his family's house. He didn't have a permanent job, so, similar to his mother in her younger days, he was searching for temporary work for short periods. However, while Ellie had to do this out of necessity, due to the economic crisis, for William, it was a result of his involvement in criminal activities. In 2004, he also took a part-time job with his friend David, helping to clean his house during construction and repairs. David had become disabled from working in the oil fields. In June, a dispute arose when tools went missing from the construction site, with both sides blaming each other. When the police arrived, William attacked David and beat him. Due to this incident, along with the previous charges, he was sentenced to 60 days in prison, but was released after only 30 days. On July 26, 2004, just an hour after his release, he returned to his workplace. David attempted to escape, but was unable to due to his disability. William then attacked David, kicking him in the head several times. As a result, David lost consciousness and died in hospital the following day. William fled the scene, but was arrested a few days later and charged with first-degree murder. In June 2005, William Nessler was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Rebecca was the only one to escape the tragic fate and now lives a normal life with her family and children, often reflecting on the absence of her mother and brother during important moments. She deeply misses her brother William, who always looked out for her. Rebecca believes that William would not have ended up in prison if their mother had not shot Daniel. This tragic event caused a series of unfortunate events that made their lives worse. Despite this, she does not resent her mother. She understands that her mother was confused and made a hasty decision. In the end, Rebecca feels that her mother's actions prevented many boys from facing the same fate. Ellie's life ended in tragedy. In addition to battling breast cancer, she faced legal troubles. She became involved in distributing illegal drugs. In 2002, she bought materials for making drugs from a police informant. Initially, Ellie provided some drugs to the informant, but 5 days later, when she returned to collect the pills, she was arrested after the informant reported her. Ellie confessed to her crimes and was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but she only served 4 years. She was released in 2006, but sadly, Ellie Nessler passed away from breast cancer on December 26, 2008, at the age of 56. When Ellie died, William asked to be released from prison to say goodbye to his mother, but his request was denied. 2 years later, in 2010, Rebecca and a reporter visited her brother in prison. They spoke for about 2.5 hours. During the conversation, William was very reflective, reviewing everything that had happened in his life. He did not try to justify his actions or blame anyone else. He noted that he felt he had been pushed down a path of self-destruction at the age of 6, a burden he would always carry. William emphasized how public opinion affected him, especially when the case of Daniel, a rapist who was murdered in court, was heavily covered by the media. The attention affected him. The whole community knew that William was also a victim, sexually abused at the age of 6. People discussed his past, which made him feel ashamed. He doesn't want this attention, but it's hard for him to escape it. Case 5. Shil Kovlin grew up on the west side of Manhattan. Shelley's life was marked by a love of learning and academic excellence, earning a degree in wealth management. This degree opened the door to a successful career in Swiss banking. Shil's career flourished, and she became skilled at managing multi-million-dollar portfolios for her clients. However, despite her professional success and financial security, Shil felt unfulfilled. She longed to start a family of her own and become a mother. In an effort to change her circumstances, Shil attended a Jewish singles event in February 1998, where she met a 26-year-old man named Rod Kovlin, who also worked in the banking sector. Shil and Rod were a young couple with many similar interests and ambitions. Their relationship developed quickly despite their significant age difference. They spent all their time together and then decided to get married, feeling that everything was just right. Some people thought they were rushing into marriage, but for Shil and Rod it was perfect. They had 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl, and their family was complete. However, their happy life was shattered on New Year's Eve 2009 when Shil died in a tragic accident. At first, the police thought it was just a freak accident. On December 30th, 2009, 2 police officers were finishing their night shift at a Manhattan police station. They received an emergency call from Rod Kovlin, Shil's husband, who had called in a panic to report that he had found Shil in her bathtub, submerged in blood, and that she was dead. He followed the police's instructions to pull her out of the water and attempt to resuscitate her. However, it soon became clear that his efforts to save her life would not be successful. As Shil's body was cold and motionless, Rod Kovlin covered her with a blanket and waited for the police to arrive. Police quickly arrived and investigated the scene. Upon arrival, they assessed the situation and blocked off a downtown Manhattan street. Initially, officers suspected that Shil's death may have been a suicide. Inside the apartment, the police found scattered children's toys. Proceeding to the bathroom, they discovered the Shil wrapped in a blanket by her husband. The bloody water in the tub and the wet floor indicated that Rod Kovlin had recently pulled the body from the water. A bleeding wound on the back of Shil's head was visible. Police found a torn hinge on the cabinet in the bathroom where Shil died, suggesting she fell after losing her grip on the doorknob. Experts concluded there was no forced entry after checking around the house. The detective working the case decided to talk to the family members. During the interview, it was discovered that Shil and Rod Kovlin's 9-year-old daughter was the first to discover her mother's body. Traumatized and shocked by what she saw, she told the police what had happened. It turned out that the night before, she and her younger brother had slept in their mother's bed. Waking up in the middle of the night and realizing that her mother was not there, she went looking for her and stumbled upon the horrifying scene in the bathroom. She quickly called her father, Rod Kovlin, who had recently separated from his mother and was downstairs. He rushed into the bathroom, pulled his wife's body out of the water, and called emergency services. Her account of the events matched Rod Kovlin's, supporting the theory that her death was an accident. The police informed Shil's family of the tragic event, leaving everyone in shock. An autopsy and forensic examination were scheduled for the following day. When the medical examiner contacted investigators to begin the examination, he was surprised to learn that this procedure would not take place, despite being necessary. This left the examiner confused. It was later discovered that a rabbi from Shil's synagogue had intervened. The rabbi contacted an organization responsible for burying Orthodox Jews, who then asked the police for permission to enter the scene in accordance with the family's religious rites. The police granted permission, and a team of rabbis arrived at the scene. They cleaned up the blood in the bathtub and prepared Shil's body for burial in accordance with the family's beliefs. Unfortunately, this process destroyed all evidence and clues before they could be examined by the police forensic department. Orthodox Jewish tradition considers autopsies unacceptable because they involve defiling the body of the deceased. The rabbi quickly stepped in to support Shil's grieving family, who were grateful for the rabbi's help. As a result, the family agreed to forego an autopsy and organize funeral arrangements. Shil was buried within 24 hours, with hundreds of people attending to pay their respects. Shil's parents questioned the cause of Shil's death. Police told them that potential evidence had been destroyed during the cleanup. They thought that a fall in the bathtub would certainly have caused the accident. But the possibility of death from such an accident seemed unlikely. The family hired a private investigator to investigate the circumstances of her death and determine whether it was indeed an accident. The private investigator begins by going to the family home to talk to Shil's relatives and learns that Shil's marriage to Rod Kovlin is having major problems. Their marriage began to fall apart after their 10th wedding anniversary in 2008. Rod Kovlin frequently changed jobs and developed a gambling addiction, spending a lot of money on gambling. Shil felt neglected because Rod Kovlin spent a lot of time playing video games. Shil was also frustrated by the amount of money Rod Kovlin's family spent on his frequent trips, and he was unfaithful to her. Shil, after discovering his email cheating, she decided to end their marriage and began the process of getting a religious divorce. However, the formal divorce process will take some time to complete. Although they are separated and experiencing strain in their relationship, they have tried to maintain their relationship for the sake of their children. Despite this effort, conflicts and disagreements between Shil and Rod Kovlin continued to arise. Shil had recently confided in her loved ones about her grievances with Rod Kovlin, characterizing him as aggressive and hot-tempered. She felt uneasy and monitored. The private detective suspected that Rod Kovlin might have been involved in his wife Shil's death due to the complexities in their marital life. To investigate further, the detective aimed to determine if a crime had occurred at the scene where Shil's body was found. He planned to inspect her apartment, but the door was sealed, requiring him to obtain a court order to gain access. Upon arriving at the scene with New York police officers, the detective attempted to unlock the door with a provided key, but it wouldn't budge. Just then, Rod Kovlin appeared from his apartment, claiming he had heard a noise and came to investigate. When questioned by the police and the detective, Rod Kovlin took the key and easily opened the door. This raised suspicions. Had Rod Kovlin genuinely heard a noise, or was he deliberately keeping an eye on the situation? The detective searched the apartment for evidence of murder. Shil's family said she was home on December 31st, but her phone was missing. A phone charger was found, but not the phone that he paid particular attention to the hinges, which investigators believed she had ripped off during a fall. The more he examined them, the more he suspected that, with Shil's strength, ripping off hinges that were firmly attached to the cabinet was impossible. The detective discussed his findings with the police, trying to convince them that Shil's death was not an accident, but a murder. However, the police remained unconvinced, citing a lack of evidence. Therefore, they decided to perform an autopsy to conclusively determine the cause of death. This decision caused a difficult debate with Shil's family. The exhumation took place 2 weeks after Shil had been buried. Her loved ones were deeply distressed by the decision. In the Jewish faith, exhumation is considered negative, and many religious leaders oppose the practice. The family needed time to think about their next steps. They felt the need to find out the truth about their daughter's death, so they agreed to exhume her body. However, the exhumation process was difficult, so the family had to apply for a special order from the prosecutor's office. Even with the family's consent, they still had to make sure that all the necessary paperwork was completed. Once all the paperwork was completed, they proceeded with the exhumation and autopsy. The autopsy results showed that Shil did not die from a fall, but from strangulation, which caused her to suffocate and break her neck. The official cause of Shil's death was revised, and it was no longer considered an accident. Instead, it was officially ruled a murder. The detective's suspicions and efforts were vindicated. The autopsy results were instrumental in prompting the New York Police Department to reopen the investigation into Shil's death. Detectives began scrutinizing new evidence, including phone records and bank statements. They also interviewed everyone who had interacted with Rod Kovlin and Shil. The attorneys shared information about Rod Kovlin and Shil during the first divorce hearing in May 2009. Rod Kovlin claimed that he could not afford the money because he was unemployed, but the judge said that he had to give up gambling and electronics. In court, Rod Kovlin's true nature was exposed, and he continued to criticize Schill, making false accusations about her lifestyle, finances, and behavior toward their son. He even called Schill's workplace to defame her. In the subsequent divorce hearing on July 7, 2009, the court banned Rod Kovlin from spending time alone with the children, a ban that remained in place even after Schill's death. The court also denied Rod Kovlin custody of the children and awarded custody to Rod Kovlin's parents through a social worker. This decision likely angered Rod Kovlin greatly. Police interviewed a former caregiver who had cared for Rod Kovlin's children before he fired her. It was discovered that on December 30th, Schill had received an expensive keratin hair treatment that cost hundreds of dollars. The care instructions emphasized avoiding humidity and high temperatures for several days, essentially prohibiting baths or showers. Schill's autopsy revealed no signs of bathing on the day of her death, leading investigators to speculate that she may not have taken a bath. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the building, which showed Rod Kovlin leaving his apartment at 4 a.m. on the day of the murder, dressed to go out. He returned a short time later. The building's security guard found this unusual, as Rod had never left the building that early. The security guard asked Rod Kovlin if he needed anything, but when he said no, Rod Kovlin returned with the chocolate bars and gave them to the security guard. Investigators believed that Rod Kovlin's actions were intentional to create an alibi, and as a result, he became the prime suspect. Schill and Rod Kovlin were still married, which meant that absent a will or divorce, Rod Kovlin would inherit her estate, which was worth over $5 million. Additionally, on December 31, 2009, Schill scheduled a meeting with her attorney to update her will and remove Rod Kovlin from the list of beneficiaries, which posed a significant threat to Rod Kovlin's rights and provided a clear motive for the crime. All of Schill's assets were frozen in a safe deposit account. It is likely that Rod Kovlin knew about Schill's plans to remove his name from her will, as he may have been monitoring her activities. A review of the surveillance footage revealed that Schill had returned home at 8 p.m. the night before the crime, talking on her phone. However, the phone had gone missing after the crime. The investigators decided to conduct another search of the crime scene, and upon returning to the apartment, they quickly found Schill's mobile phone lying on her bedside table, still connected to the charger. When questioned by the police, Rod Kovlin hired a lawyer, Ed, who advised him to remain silent. As a result, investigators had to continue searching for new evidence implicating Rod Kovlin. When they examined Rod Kovlin's phone records, they discovered frequent calls to the number of Deborah Holmes, a married woman with 3 children. 5 months before Schill's murder, Rod Kovlin and Deborah met at a sick-bow tournament and began a passionate affair. They often met at sick-bow tournaments or played together online. Investigators saw an opportunity to gather information and decided to contact Deborah with a few questions. However, to their surprise, Deborah responded that her attorney had asked her not to cooperate. Faced with Deborah's refusal to speak, the police asked for the name of her attorney. The response revealed that Deborah and Rod Kovlin were the same attorney. As a last resort, the police searched Schill's newly discovered phone for incriminating text messages or electronic communications between Rod and Deborah. All data had been completely erased by a professional. Even skilled programmers were unable to recover the deleted messages. Over time, it became clear that he had succeeded in evading justice. While his crimes may have been well executed, the rabbi's meticulous cleaning of the bathroom was a major factor in hampering the investigation. By removing all traces of blood and other evidence, they destroyed DNA, making it increasingly difficult for investigators to collect evidence. The case stalled because Rod Kovlin confessed to the crime, and a lack of evidence prevented the case from going to trial. 5 years have passed since the investigation into Schill's death began, but no arrests have been made. Police have searched for clues and evidence of Rod Kovlin's involvement in Schill's death for years, but to no avail. However, the case took a turn when Rod Kovlin's mistress, Deborah, came forward. She contacted the police, and they invited her to the station for questioning. Deborah had recently broken up with Rod Kovlin, which prompted her to contact the police. She shared information with the police that Rod Kovlin had conspired to gain custody of the children, but because he was a suspect in Schill's death and did not have custody of the children, he could not access the money Schill left behind. Rod Kovlin hatched a sinister plan to get his hands on Schill's fortune. Rod Kovlin planned to manipulate his 15-year-old daughter into falsely accusing her grandfather, Rod Kovlin's father, of assaulting her. This would result in the grandfather being imprisoned and losing custody of his granddaughter, and Rod Kovlin would give his daughter a large sum of money upon completion of the mission. Meanwhile, Rod Kovlin had been secretly withdrawing funds from the only account he had access to, which was meant for his children's education. His parents discovered that he was misusing the money and were extremely unhappy with his lack of concern for his children's well-being. This led to a heated dispute between Rod Kovlin and his parents. Rod Kovlin's anger towards his parents escalated to the point where he considered harming them. In 2012, he confided in his lover, Deborah, about his plan to have his daughter poison his parents' tea with rat poison. He believed that since his daughter was a minor, she would receive a lighter sentence if caught. Following this, Rod Kovlin came up with several other schemes. He considered burning down his parents' house and trapping them inside by jamming the doors. Rod Kovlin also thought about arranging a fake marriage for his daughter to a Mexican man, which would have forced her to give up part of her inheritance to him. The police were shocked by the details of Rod Kovlin's plans. Deborah secretly collected evidence, storing a large amount of data on hard drives. Deborah realized she was dealing with a psychopath, and she waited until after she broke up with Rod Kovlin to share the evidence with the police. The recordings she collected of Rod Kovlin's conversations with various people. The police now had to listen carefully to these recordings to find conclusive evidence. Deborah's contribution to the investigation was crucial. As the investigators analyzed the recordings, they made a surprising discovery. In a conversation with a friend he met through backgammon, Rod Kovlin casually mentioned that he had keys to Sheil's apartment and could enter it at any time. Investigators found that Rod Kovlin was plotting against his own daughter, planning to pin the responsibility for the Sheil's demise on her. Thanks to all the information gathered, the police finally had compelling evidence to charge Rod Kovlin with the demise of his wife. On November 1st, 2015, Rod Kovlin was arrested. Sheil's family awaited the trial of their daughter's perpetrator, but victory was not assured. Rod Kovlin, while incarcerated, shared intimate details of his wife's murder with a fellow inmate. He even reenacted the strangulation, which matched the autopsy results. During the 7-week trial, the jury heard testimony about the heinous crimes he planned to commit, including murdering his wife, targeting his parents, and framing his own children. The jury was horrified by his cold-blooded nature. In March 2019, the court convicted Rod Kovlin of murdering his wife, Sheil. Although there was no direct eyewitness, the overwhelming evidence led to a life imprisonment sentence. With the possibility of parole after 25 years, Rod Kovlin will no longer pose a threat to his family or the people of New York. Case 6. The case of Autumn Taggart in 2018. Autumn Taggart was a single mother living in Windsor, a city near the U.S.-Canada border. She resided about a mile from the border that separates Michigan, USA, from Ontario, Canada, with her 9-year-old son, Gavin. On Saturday, June 9, 2018, Autumn, Gavin, and Chris Sherwin, Gavin's father and Autumn's ex-husband, spent the afternoon together. Despite their breakup, Autumn and Chris had remained on friendly terms, prioritizing their co-parenting of Gavin to minimize the negative effects of their divorce. By the late afternoon, they went grocery shopping together. Afterward, which Chris drove Autumn and Gavin to the building where they lived on the 3rd floor. After saying goodbye, Chris returned home. Before bed, Gavin played video games with his mother. He had no idea later that night would turn into a terrifying nightmare. Later that night, while it was still dark, Gavin woke up to a strange noise. He opened his eyes to find an unfamiliar man standing next to his bed. The stranger instructed Gavin to close his eyes and go back to sleep. Then he left Gavin's room. Gavin heard his mother scream a minute later, and the sound sent a chill down his spine, filling him with a sense of dread. A few minutes passed, and eerie silence filled the air. His mother's screams had stopped, and he eventually drifted off to sleep. In the morning, Gavin got out of bed and rushed to his mom's room. The room was in disarray, with everything smashed and destroyed. His mom, Autumn, was lying motionless on the bed. At first, Gavin thought his mother was just sleeping, but the blood on her nose made it clear something was seriously wrong. As the devastating truth set in, that his mom had passed away, it shocked him. Gavin didn't want to believe it was true. Desperate to escape the pain, Gavin spent the morning playing video games and watching YouTube, trying to distract himself from the truth. However, as the day wore on, the emotions became too much to bear. In the afternoon, Gavin broke down in tears and knew he had to tell someone what had happened. Gathering his courage, Gavin went back to his mom's room, grabbed her phone, and texted his dad, Chris, on Messenger. With shaking hands, he typed out a message, telling his dad that Autumn wouldn't wake up. As soon as Chris received the message, he and his girlfriend rushed to Gavin's house. After parking, Chris exited his car and saw his son standing behind a sliding glass door on the third floor of the building. Since Chris didn't have an electronic key to enter, Gavin came downstairs to let him in. Chris then asked his son to stay with his girlfriend while he checked on Autumn, who was not waking up. Upon entering the apartment and bedroom, Chris found Autumn pale and bruised with a bloody nose. He immediately called 911, and the police and ambulance responded to the scene. However, the paramedics declared Autumn dead due to the severity of her injuries and evidence of a struggle in the bedroom. Ruling out the possibility of an accident as investigators searched the apartment for evidence, a specialist interviewed Gavin to gather more information. The boy revealed that a stranger had entered their house and told him to go back to sleep. He reported hearing his mother's screams, which eventually stopped. Gavin also described the man he saw in his room, recalling that the man was of average height, white, and had disheveled hair, appearing as though he had just woken up. The boy's testimony described the suspect as skinny, but not extremely so. A forensic examination after Autumn's death concluded she died from strangulation, with visible signs of a prior beating and genital injuries. Male DNA was also found on Autumn's body. The police investigated to answer three main questions. How did the perpetrator gain entry to the apartment? What was the motive behind the crime? And most crucially, the identity of the suspect. The police quickly ruled out the possibility that the killer was a tenant in the building. Since Gavin was familiar with all his neighbors, and the man he saw on the night of the crime was a stranger to him, this led them to look elsewhere for a suspect. To enter Autumn's apartment, the perpetrator needed more than just an electronic key to the building. However, there were no signs of forced entry on the door leading to the apartment. This initially led investigators to consider two possibilities. Autumn might have let the perpetrator in herself or forgotten to lock the door. Investigations later revealed that neither assumption was correct. The perpetrator had instead climbed to the third floor, starting from the balcony on the second floor, then accessing the apartment Autumn's as the door was open. Along with a DNA sample, the police found fingerprints at the scene and sought to identify the owner. It was 12 days after the body was discovered that the police released the victim's identity in hopes of gathering tips from the public. Anyone with potential information about the case was asked to contact detectives. On the night of the crime, a witness reported seeing a new black SUV, believed to be a Honda Pilot, in the parking lot next to the building. The SUV was present until around 6 a.m. Detectives suspected that the SUV's owner might be connected to Autumn's death, speculating that the perpetrator could have used the vehicle's roof as a stepping point to access the balcony. This building had distinctive protrusions at its corners that could have aided the perpetrator in climbing from the second floor to the third. During their investigation, police analyzed mobile phone activity around Autumn's residence on the night of the incident. The nighttime occurrence actually simplified their task, as most people were asleep, resulting in fewer active phone numbers in the area. Detectives discovered that one of the phone numbers belonged to Autumn's neighbor, Michelle. Although Michelle lived in the same building as Autumn, she said in an interview with police that she knew nothing. However, phone records showed that not only was Michelle on the phone while in her apartment, but she also traveled throughout the city multiple times. Additionally, she had turned off her phone around the time of the incident. While the phone's location indicated she was either in or near her apartment at the time, the exact location was difficult to pinpoint due to the inherent margin of error in location tracking. Detectives went back to question Michelle again, sensing she was hiding something about the case. At first, she denied knowing or hearing anything, but when police warned her that withholding information could make her an accomplice, she opened up. Michelle revealed that around 2 a.m., a man named Gitesh Bogle contacted her and her boyfriend, seeking to buy an illicit substance and was interested in hiring an escort girl. Michelle and her boyfriend agreed to meet Gitesh. They first stopped at an ATM, where Gitesh withdrew cash. Then, Gitesh purchased some of the substance from Michelle and her boyfriend, who were its dealers. However, Gitesh asked them to sell him more. Michelle instructed Gitesh to drive to the parking lot near her building. Once they arrived at the building, the three of them took illicit substances. Then, Michelle and her boyfriend decided to steal the remaining drugs and escape, leaving Gitesh behind. Remarkably, before running away, Michelle hid a bag of this addictive substance in her genital area. Although the details of how she did this are not provided, it is an important fact that will become relevant later. According to Michelle, she and her boyfriend grabbed the substance and some of Gitesh's cash and ran to the building's entrance. They then entered their apartment and locked themselves in, remaining quiet and keeping the lights off. Since Gitesh didn't have an electronic key, he was unable to enter the building. He also refrained from shouting or honking his car horn, fearing someone would alert the police. From their apartment window, Michelle and her boyfriend observed shoe marks on the roof of Gitesh's car. Gitesh drove away around 6 a.m. Investigators hypothesized that Gitesh had attempted to sneak into the building to retrieve the stolen substance and money. However, not knowing Michelle's apartment, he likely entered Autumn's apartment by mistake. The police now have the phone number and photo of suspect Gitesh. The image was captured from a security camera where Gitesh had withdrawn cash to purchase the substance, and an ATM camera also took his picture. After verifying the phone number, investigators discovered that he was a 27-year-old Canadian citizen. He worked as a car development engineer in Warren, Michigan, and owned a black Honda Pilot SUV. Initially, Gitesh regularly commuted to Windsor, Canada by crossing the river via bridge or tunnel. However, authorities tracked his movements, revealing he had left Canada on the morning of June 10th, the day Autumn died, and he has not returned to the country since. Following the release of information about a black SUV at Autumn's house, Gitesh sold his vehicle. The Canadian police collaborated with their American counterparts, learning that Gitesh planned to relocate from Michigan to Washington State, where his parents resided in Kent. After relinquishing his job and left Canada, Gitesh's actions raised suspicions. Nevertheless, the police required concrete evidence to make an arrest and facilitate his extradition to Canada. To investigate Autumn's death, the Windsor police sought assistance from the U.S. National Security Agency to track Gitesh's movements. A DNA sample found on Autumn's body likely belonged to the suspect, Gitesh, but a confirmed match was needed. Gitesh, attempting to evade detection, made several attempts to disguise himself. He shaved his beard and wore blue contact lenses to alter his appearance. However, Gitesh eventually made a mistake. During a visit to a bar in Warren, he left behind a used glass, which U.S. agents seized to obtain his DNA. The comparison of Gitesh's DNA to the DNA on Autumn's body took time, but the outcome was predictable. The test confirmed that the DNA on Autumn's body belonged to Gitesh. On August 17, 2018, over 2 months after Autumn's death, Gitesh was arrested at his parents' residence in Kent, Washington. The arrest caught Gitesh off guard, as he seemed to believe he had evaded detection. U.S. authorities have initiated the process of extraditing Gitesh to his home country. In the extradition documents, the prosecutor stated that Gitesh is a threat to society, at risk of fleeing, and unpredictable. Following this development, Canadian police charged Gitesh with the murder of Autumn Taggart. Due to national restrictions, it was not until November 2021 that Gitesh's trial took place. The trial was held across 3 separate courtrooms. In the main courtroom were the judge, the prosecutor, the jury, Gitesh, and Gitesh's defense team, all present for the proceedings. 2 additional courtrooms were equipped with large screens to broadcast the trial to Autumn's family members and other attendees. During the trial, Gitesh pleaded not guilty to the first-degree murder charge. He claimed that Autumn's death was accidental. According to Gitesh, on the night in question, Michelle and her boyfriend stole money and an illicit substance from him. The incident upset Gitesh, prompting him to exit his vehicle and pursue Michelle. However, due to his intoxication from consuming a substantial amount of alcohol and substances, Gitesh's memory of that night's incident is very limited. He recalled entering Autumn's apartment after climbing onto the balcony. However, he claimed he mistook her for Michelle, someone he believed had previously robbed him, on he finding Autumn asleep in her bed. Autumn woke up and screamed, but Gitesh immediately ordered her to be quiet. However, she continued to scream, and in an attempt to silence her, he covered her mouth with his hand. Unfortunately, this action caused Autumn to suffocate. Gitesh later claimed that he did not realize he had caused Autumn death until her screaming stopped. He attempted to revive her with CPR, but it was unsuccessful. Additionally, Gitesh did not recall how Autumn sustained genital injuries or how he left her apartment. His lawyers argued that the crime was not premeditated, citing Gitesh's extreme intoxication and inability to control his actions as the reason. According to them, his actions, including covering Autumn's mouth to silence her, were not a deliberate to take her life. According to defense attorney Peter Thorning, Gitesh was too drunk to fully understand the consequences of his actions. Peter emphasized that Gitesh's behavior could be attributed to his intoxication, and that the tragic outcome was unintentional, stating, "Sometimes terrible things happen without us intending the result, and that is what happened in this case." The lawyers pointed out a crucial aspect of the case. There was no evidence that Gitesh had engaged in intercourse with Autumn. This detail is significant, as it could impact Gitesh's sentence. Although Gitesh's DNA was found on Autumn's body, it was not seminal fluid. The lawyers argued that the appearance Gitesh's DNA could be the result of cross-contamination, where DNA is transferred from one surface to another. This could have occurred through the gloves of a forensic expert, for example. Gitesh's lawyers attempted to prove that John Lord, who worked in the forensic unit during the investigation, mishandled evidence and accidentally transferred their Gitesh's DNA to Autumn's body. John Lord's responsibilities included photographing the crime scene and collecting evidence that came into direct contact with Autumn. The defense lawyer, Peter Thorning, suggested that John Lord may have caused cross-contamination by rotating the body on the bed sheet, which was seized as evidence. This action could have resulted in the transfer of DNA or fluids between the body and the sheet. During cross-examination, John Lord testified. Peter Thorning asked John Lord if he had received proper training to work as a forensic identification expert. John Lord replied that he had taken precautions to prevent cross-contamination by changing gloves between handling each piece of evidence and using his camera to take photographs. John Lord searched Autumn's room for fluids such as urine, saliva, and semen. The reason for this search is that the likelihood of a sexual assault is higher when the victim is female. During the trial, John Lord testified that he found no indication of a sexual assault based on his search for fluids. John Lord stated in court that his investigation did not reveal any signs of a sexual assault on or around Autumn's body. He also did not find any evidence of a struggle. According to John Lord, a typical struggle usually leaves behind signs such as forced entry, tampered locks, or blood spatter, but none of these indicators were found at the crime scene. In contrast, the prosecutor offered a different perspective. Referencing a past instance where Michelle hid a substance in her genital area, the prosecutor suggested that they knew about this and searched Autumn's body in the same area. He claimed that even though Gitesh used his hand, the act was still a form of assault. The prosecutor expressed strong disapproval of Gitesh's actions. During questioning by the prosecutor, Gitesh was asked why he did not immediately call 911 when Autumn stopped breathing. Gitesh responded he disagreed, although the context of this response is unclear. Gitesh expressed his fear that the police would not believe him if he reported what happened. During his testimony, Gitesh admitted that he had limited recollection of the incident that transpired in Autumn's room. However, he specifically remembered performing CPR on Autumn after she stopped screaming, which involved administering 15 chest compressions and 3 rescue breaths. The prosecutor questioned Gitesh's claim that the strangulation of Autumn was accidental. The prosecutor argued that if the defendant's intention was simply to silence Autumn, he could have achieved this by covering her mouth, rather than also closing her nose. This deliberate action, the prosecutor suggested, indicates that the defendant understood the consequences of his actions. Autumn's son, Gavin, also provided testimony during the trial. Gavin's testimony was given in a separate room from the main courtroom, accompanied by a support worker. Gavin said someone came into his room and spoke to him, but he doesn't remember what they said. The person stood close to him, but they didn't touch him. After they left, Gavin heard his mother screaming in the distance. This part of the experience felt like a dream, but eventually it stopped and he fell asleep again. And he woke up in the morning. The next morning, Gavin went to his mother's room and found it in disarray. Everything was knocked over, broken, or destroyed. At first, he thought his mother was just sleeping, but then Gavin noticed blood on her nose and realized that she was actually dead. He was in shock and couldn't process what he was seeing. Despite feeling overwhelmed, Gavin tried to cope with the situation by carrying on with his day as usual. Gavin recalls spending part of that day playing games and watching YouTube videos. It wasn't until later in the day, June 10, 2018, that he finally mustered the courage to send a message to his father using his mother's phone. He couldn't keep what had happened to myself any longer and needed to tell someone. Chris Sherwin, Autumn Taggart's ex-husband and the father of Gavin, testified about his last contact with her. He received a text message from her around 12:30 a.m. on June 10th. When he sent another text message the next morning, there was no response. This is when he began to worry. Later, he received a text message from Autumn's phone, which turned out to be from their son. A copy of these text messages was presented in court for the jury to examine. On December 1st, 2021, a 12-member jury found Gitesh Bogle of first-degree murder, but they did not find sufficient evidence that he had intercourse with Autumn. On January 5th, 2022, the court sentenced Gitesh Bogle to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Gitesh appeared in jail via video, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and wearing a black mask. He sat with his back against a wall, away from the camera. When the judge asked if he wanted to say anything, he expressed his feelings of sorrow and remorse. Gitesh said he find it difficult to put into words the sorrow and remorse his feel. Case 7. Another horrible case, the case of Leanne Tiernan. Leanne Tiernan, born on September 27, 1984, is the daughter of Michael Tiernan and Sharon Hawkhead from Bramley. Her parents divorced early, but Leanne maintains a good relationship with her father. She and her sister, Michelle, live with their mother in Leeds, while their father remains a significant part of their lives. Leanne also enjoys spending time with her grandparents. She walks them to church every Sunday morning. Leanne also loves chocolate so much that an uncle has nicknamed her Chocolate Chip Niece. Leanne, a cheerful teenage student at West Leeds High School, is working hard toward her GCSEs. After studying diligently for her exams, Leanne decides to have a day out with her 15-year-old best friend, Sarah Whitehouse. Sunday, November 26, 2000, starts out bright and sunny. After church with her grandmother, she returned home and prepared to go. Shopping with Sarah, Leanne wore a black and white striped sweater, black trousers, and high black boots. She also wore a blue jacket. Her hair was tied in a French twist, which her mother loved, and she set off to meet Sarah. The two took the bus to Leeds City Centre. After shopping, they took the bus back home to Bramley. At around 4:50 p.m., they got off the bus and walked a short distance to Sarah's house before parting ways. Sarah saw Leanne walking towards Howley Gill. It was a deserted, unlit path in the woods, a shortcut that Leanne's mother had forbidden her to take at night. However, since it was still light, Leanne felt safe on this public path. It was only a 20-minute walk home. When Sarah called Leanne's house at 5:20 p.m. to talk, she was surprised to find that Leanne had not yet returned home. Sharon immediately called Leanne's cell phone to look for her, but there was no response. Sharon continued to call several times, but the phone only rang a few times before going dead. Finally, at 7:00 p.m. that evening, Sharon called the local police station to report her daughter missing. That same night, the family went to the local church to get flashlights to search the area. In the early morning, Leanne's was looked for, but there was no answer and no sign of her. West Yorkshire Police, led by Inspector Chris Gregg, launched an intensive search for her. It was a daunting task, with the area home to more than 700 houses, vacant lots, woodlands, canals, drains, and wells, many potential hiding places for the teenager. Despite the difficulties, the police were determined to find a way to bring Leanne home safely. Helicopters patrolled overhead while uniformed officers and sniffer dogs searched every nook and cranny of the streets. Litter collection was temporarily suspended to ensure that no evidence was lost. However, after a week, there was still no trace of Leanne. Investigators retraced Leanne's last steps. They were assisted by Leanne's 19-year-old sister, Michelle, and her best friend, Sarah. Michelle wore the clothes Leanne had been wearing and followed the route her sister had taken when she missing. "We tried our best, but we hoped that she had run away and that nothing bad had happened," Michelle later said. When the story was broadcast on TV, several witnesses contacted investigators to say they had seen a man walking a black and tan dog in the Howley Gill area just an hour before Leanne got off the bus to go home. Investigators sketched out a general description of the man, about 5 feet 1 inch tall, with a stocky build and a round face that may have been scarred. He was seen wearing a 3/4 length waterproof jacket and dirty jeans, along with a black beanie. Police quickly alerted the public and received numerous calls. All of the dog owners became suspects. Ultimately, 70 dog owners were identified, but all were ruled out as suspects. The case has gone cold as there is little new information to go on. However, the public continues to support Leanne Tiernan's family and is doing everything it can to keep her story in the spotlight. Sean Clark, a father of 3 from Leeds, heard about the case and offered a £10,000 reward for information, leading to Leanne being found safe. Iceland Foods, a supermarket chain, has printed Leanne's picture and details on milk cartons sold in stores across the country. Flyers and signs featuring Leanne in her uniform and the words, "Have you seen me?" have appeared in towns and cities. The police have received some information and have been able to confirm sightings of Leanne in areas as far afield as Doncaster and Blackpool, but all the information and reports of sightings have not brought them any closer to finding her. Leanne's parents have been in the media, making desperate appeals for the public to help find their daughter. It has been a very dark Christmas for Leanne's family and loved ones. Leanne's father left Christmas presents under the tree for his missing daughter, and the Life CD that Michelle had bought for Leanne has remained unopened. Months have passed since they began searching for her. They have sometimes felt depressed, fearing that she had been kidnapped and would never return. But Michelle said we couldn't believe it. Every day when we didn't hear from her, we would ask ourselves, is she coming home today? In the end, more than 2,000 homes, sheds, and outbuildings along the route they believe Leanne took on her way home from the shopping trip were searched. A detective explained, "We had to establish the route she might have taken. We called it the Red Route." Police took DNA samples from more than 140 men in the area and carried out searches at various locations across Leeds. However, they found no trace of the young woman. Her family and friends remained hopeful that she would return safely. On August 20th, 2001, 9 months after Leanne went missing, police found a body in Woodland in North Yorkshire. This ended any hope that Leanne, alive. Police called the family to inform them of the discovery. On the day Leanne's classmates returned to school to collect their GCSE results, Mark Bisson was walking his 2 dogs in Linley Woods, a densely wooded area just inside the North Yorkshire County border. He came across what looked like a pile of rubbish, but it turned out to be a floral quilt. He loosened the string holding the quilt together and found what looked like a body wrapped in bin bags. Police arrived at the scene and completely removed the blanket and 9 thick green garbage bags, revealing a clothed body. The victim's hands were tied behind her back with 3 yellow cable ties, and a leather dog collar was tightly secured around her neck. Investigators pulled the black garbage bag off her head to reveal the decomposing face of a young woman. At the time of her discovery, authorities were unable to determine the exact cause of death, but there was a suggestion that strangulation may have been the cause. This was not the first time a body had been found at the site. In 1992, the body of Yvonne Fitt was discovered in the same area, and the killer was never caught. Detectives hope this case will not end in the same way. Fingerprints identified the body as that of Leanne Tiernan. An autopsy revealed that she had been strangled with a plastic cable, resulting in her death. The disappearance has been classified as a murder. Authorities believe that the perpetrator is a local people. First, Leanne's body was found 16 miles from where she was last seen. Additionally, the yellow cable used to bind her hands came from the British postal system, specifically used by Royal Mail or Parcel Force. Finally, the green bin bags in which Leanne was wrapped came from Morrison's, a large grocery chain with 2 stores in the area. DNA samples were collected from people involved, such as family members, friends, and known sex offenders in the area, in an attempt to match DNA. On September 28th, the day after Leanne's 17th birthday, she was buried at Sanford Methodist Church in Bramley, Leeds. The church where Leanne was baptized was filled with hundreds of people paying their respects. Many spilled out onto the streets to honor her memory and share stories of Leanne's life and optimism. All attendees were dressed in brightly colored clothing. Leanne's mother, sister, and close friends, along with others, carried a white coffin into the church. A wreath bearing the words, "Night Night Baby," and the Guns N' Roses song, "November Rain," were featured at the service. The congregation sang her favorite hymns, including "Give Me Oil in My Lamp, and Ye Shall Go Out with Joy." Inspector Chris Craig was among those who attended Leanne's funeral. When he saw Leanne's coffin being brought to Hilltop Cemetery, where she was laid to rest, his determination to find her killers and bring them to justice grew stronger than ever. After conducting tests on a sample of the victim's heart tissue, the medical examiner concluded that the victim had been murdered on the day of her abduction and that the body had been refrigerated for months. Several weeks before the victim was found, the killer attempted to dispose of the body by dumping it in a public dumpster, covered with a blanket. The killer likely hoped the body would end up in a landfill, but that did not work. Worse still, the killer hid the body so well that it made it extremely difficult to collect forensic and DNA evidence. Law enforcement hoped to make a quick breakthrough in identifying the killer. However, that hope was dashed when the results showed that no DNA from the killer was found on Leanne. They decided to investigate the items found with her. Investigators discovered dog hair on Leanne's clothing, leading them to believe they could profile the pet's DNA, and from there, identify the killer. The hairs were sent to a university in Texas, which had developed a technique for profiling pet DNA. However, the university was only able to identify a partial DNA profile of the dog. This was the first time a dog's DNA profile had been collected in a case in the UK, but there was no dog to compare it to, so the results were not used. The scarf found around Leanne's neck, which contained her hair, was a vital clue. Investigators tested the hairs for DNA and created a DNA profile. They then focused on a dog collar that had been used to wrap the liner around the victim's neck. The collar was manufactured by Armitage Leather Products in Nottingham. If the killer had purchased the collar from this company, investigators hoped to establish the name or address of the suspect. The company had reported that it had sold its products to 220 different wholesalers across the UK and had provided sales receipts to the police. Investigators began contacting each company to see if they had any records of sales to the Leeds area of West Yorkshire. They gained a lot of useful information from this investigation. Pet Pajamas, a mail order for a company based in Liverpool, had sold 3 leather collars and leashes from Armitage. Information about these 3 customers was passed on to investigators and began looking into their backgrounds. One of these customers quickly became a suspect. His name was John Taylor, and he lived in Bramley, just about 3/4 of a mile from where Leanne missing. This suspect had been mentioned earlier in the investigation. When Leanne's body was discovered, witnesses claimed that he had been in the woods with his dog. However, when questioned, he claimed that his dog had died before Leanne was murdered. Did John kill his pet to destroy evidence? Investigators wanted to know more about John. When asked how often he had been to the area where Leanne had missing, he claimed it was not a place he had ever visited and stated that he certainly did not go there with a dog. On the outside, John appeared to be a normal man. He was a 45-year-old parcel delivery driver working for Parcel Force, A division of the Royal Mail. His only previous conviction was for stealing a suit of clothes when he was 15. John was married and had 2 children, a son born in 1981 and a daughter born in 1983. The couple divorced in 1996. John lived alone in a terraced house on Cockshot Road in Leeds. However, there were concerns that he enjoyed torturing the animals he hunted. His neighbors thought he was a normal person, but they had witnessed him catching torturing rabbits, as well as stabbing a fox several times during his poaching trips. He also seemed to enjoy killing pheasants. After moving to his new home on Cockshot Road in 1982, John began keeping and breeding dogs and ferrets. His wife at the time, Janet, was usually proud of their home, but the stench from the animal feces gradually affected their marriage. She tolerated the situation until one day when he brought home 2 large owls to raise in the house. The owls lived on a diet of newly hatched chicks, which he had bought by the thousands and stored in a large freezer on the property. Janet eventually decided to file for divorce. After that, John traveled across the country, but not for work. Instead, he sought women and often engaged in sexual encounters. He also used Lonely Hearts ads. Through John's phone records, investigators began to track down women to interview. Most described him as harmless, but some admitted that they had called the police to report him as a suspect after Leanne's body was discovered and revealed details about her murder. 2 women painted a picture of a man with violent tendencies. One woman mentioned that he had asked to have sex with her daughter. An ex-girlfriend broke up with John due to his interest in bondage. He would tie her hands with rope and cover her face with a scarf. When the investigator asked her to describe how John bound her, she said he used a bundle of ropes that he kept in a drawer next to her bed. Specifically, he placed a plastic rope around each of her wrists, and then used a 3rd rope to tie both of her hands behind her back. This method was similar to how Leanne was found, and this information has never been made public. Police arrested and questioned John. They took a DNA sample from him and searched his home and personal property. Police quickly cordoned off John's home on Cockshot Road, erected a 7-foot wall, and conducted a thorough search of the property. In the backyard, they found a hedge, a plum tree, and a poplar. Pollen patterns consistent with these plants were found on Leanne's hair, skin, and nasal passages, indicating that she had been there before she was murdered. When they dug up the garden, they discovered the remains of several animals, including 28 ferrets in a mass grave and the skeletons of 4 dogs. One of the dogs, which was brown and black, appeared to have suffered head trauma. It is possible that John killed the dog to cover up his involvement. When police learned that a man with a dog was being sooked, hairs from the terrier were tested and matched those found on Leanne's body. Inside the house, the carpet had been removed. However, upon closer inspection, investigators found some pink carpet fibers caught in nails on the floor. These fibers matched exactly those found on Leanne's body. They also discovered Leanne's blood on the floor. The green bin bag that was tied around Leanne's body was manufactured in Devon. The manufacturer informed investigators that they had only produced a small quantity of this type of rope, which was used to make rabbit nets. The rope found at John's home matched the rope used on Leanne's body. In addition, a large quantity of distinctive yellow zip ties, manufactured by an Italian company for the Royal Mail, were found in his home. John, an employee of Parcel Force, a division of the Royal Mail, could have easily obtained these zip ties. Police also found a similar type of bin bag wrapped around a nail in John's kitchen. Furthermore, there were 3 RG freezers on John's property at first. John denied any involvement in knowing Leanne or having anything to do with her. However, when investigators presented all the evidence they had gathered, John eventually admitted that he had kidnapped Leanne but insisted that her death was an accident. According to John's testimony after taking Leanne home, there was a struggle and Leanne fell, hitting her head and dying on the spot. However, no evidence supported the claim that Leanne fell. Additionally, John could not explain why Leanne was strangled or why her hands were tied with cables. Investigators have gained a better understanding of what happened to Leanne that night. Leanne was walking alone through the dark, unlit streets of Hollygill when John attacked her from behind. Although there were no direct witnesses, it was reported that someone heard a muffled scream. John covered her mouth and eyes with a scarf, wrapped her in a coat, and took her to his home, which took 22 minutes. There, he tied her hands behind her back and made her sit on a bench in the old kitchen. He strangled her with a cord and a scarf, then kept her body in the kitchen freezer for months. Before Leanne's body was discovered, his friends reported that a freezer in his kitchen was missing. Investigators believe that the freezer may have been damaged, prompting John to dispose of Leanne's body, a decision that ultimately led to his arrest. On February 15, 2002, John Taylor, 46, was convicted of Leanne's murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 2 life terms and must serve 20 years before he can be considered for parole. Investigators believe this was not John's first crime. The way he hid and disposed of the body was carefully planned, suggesting he had committed offenses before. After police identified John's DNA in a database, they linked him to 2 previous attacks. The first attack occurred on October 18, 1988, when John, wearing a mask and wielding a knife, attacked a 32-year-old woman. NS. She walked past Hollygill to pick up her children from school. The second incident occurred on March 1, 1989, when John, wearing a mask and wielding a knife, broke into the home of a 21-year-old mother. He dragged her into a bedroom and attacked her, stripping, blindfolding, and gagging her before assaulting her, while her 18-month-old daughter cried in the next room. John received 2 additional sentences for these crimes. In the years that followed, police conducted a nationwide review of unsolved cases similar to Leanne's. In 2018, John admitted to a series of sexual offenses against 5 women between 1977 and 1996, highlighting the seriousness of his misconduct. In another incident, he held a woman at knife point and forced her to perform a sexual act on him in 1977, just before Christmas. John Taylor was sentenced to life in prison for assaulting and attacking a barmaid. He is currently serving his sentence at Wakefield Prison, a maximum security facility also known as Monster Mansion, which houses many dangerous criminals who have committed extremely serious crimes. John has been implicated in nearly 10 unsolved murders. Among them is the murder of Yvonne Fitt, a 33-year-old woman whose body was found in a shallow grave about 100 yards from where Leanne's body was dumped in 1992. Lindsay Reimer, a 13-year-old girl, also missing after leaving home to run an errand, and her body was found 5 months later in a canal less than 20 miles from John's home in Bramley. Deborah Woods was found at Elite train station. She was discovered in a bin bag, wrapped in bedding after being stored in a cold storage room. Rebecca Hall, a prostitute, died in Bradford, along with several others. Questions remain about how many murders and attacks John may have committed, and how long he may have evaded capture. That he has managed to avoid arrest for so long is concerning. Case 8. The case of Sylvia Likens. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana, USA, to carnival workers Lester Likens and his wife Betty Likens, formerly Grimes. She was the third of 5 children, with 2 older twins, Daniel and Diana, and 2 younger twins, Benny and Jenny. Sylvia's younger sister Jenny had polio, which left her with a significantly weakened leg, causing her to limp noticeably. She had to wear a steel brace on her leg to help her walk. Sylvia's parents had a tumultuous marriage, with constant moving and financial struggles. They worked at carnival booths throughout Indiana during the summer, selling candy, beer, and soft drinks. To help out, the Likens children would often travel with their parents, but Sylvia and Jenny frequently stayed with relatives, mostly their grandmother. This arrangement not only kept the young girls safe, but also allowed them to have a more stable education. From a young age, Sylvia took on various responsibilities, including babysitting, running errands for neighbors and friends, and completing household chores like ironing clothes. In doing so, she earned some money, which she used to buy things for herself and occasionally shared with her mom. Those who knew her described Sylvia as a friendly, confident, and charming girl. She had long, wavy, light brown hair that fell just below her shoulders, and her friends affectionately called her Cookie. Despite her vibrant personality, Sylvia was self-conscious about her smile due to a missing front tooth, which she lost during a childhood accident while playing with one of her brothers. Sylvia loved music, particularly the Beatles, and was very protective of her younger sister Jenny, who was shy and less secure. The sisters frequently visited a local skating rink where Sylvia would assist Jenny, holding her hand as Jenny relied heavily on her stronger leg. In June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Likens were living with their parents in Indianapolis. The following month, their mother was arrested and jailed for theft. Shortly thereafter, their father arranged for his younger daughters to stay with Gertrude Benesai, a mother of 2 girls, Paula and Stephanie, whom the Likens sisters had met at Arsenal Technical High School. Gertrude promised their father that she would care for the girls as if they were her own until his return, which was expected to be just after the 4th of July celebrations. The Likens sisters, Sylvia and Jenny, moved into the Benesai home at 3850 East New York Street. Their father, older brothers, and eventually their mother went on the road with a carnival on the East Coast. As part of the arrangement, Gertrude Benesai would receive $20 a week to care for the sisters until their family returned in November. At first, things seemed normal at the household. Sylvia got along well with Stephanie, bonding over their shared love of popular music and helping with household chores. The Likens sisters regularly attended Sunday school with the other Benesai kids, and the pastor often commended Sylvia for her kindness and respect for sacred matters. However, when the payments for hosting the girls started coming in late, Gertrude's frustration mounted, and she began to mistreat them. This mistreatment involved physical punishments with thick objects, which eventually escalated into regular beatings, starvation, and humiliation. Sylvia faced the brunt of the abuse. Gertrude and her daughter Paula repeatedly accused Sylvia of engaging in inappropriate behavior with boys, which led to Gertrude physically kicking Sylvia in the groin and Paula physically attacking her. The girls were forced to eat food they disliked, and Sylvia was even beaten by Stephanie's boyfriend, Randolph Hubbard. Daily life at the Banffy residence was brutal. Violence escalated over time. Paula's attacks on Sylvia were savage, including punching her in the face and breaking her own wrist. She targeted Sylvia's mouth and eyes, then used her cast to inflict more harm. The sisters faced relentless verbal and psychological abuse, including Gertrude's cruel accusations of promiscuity and forced attacks on each other. The abuse of Sylvia didn't only come from the Banofsky family. Coy Hubbard and his friends would visit Gertrude's home, tormenting Sylvia physically and verbally. Gertrude and her kids would join in, inflicting harm. Neighborhood kids would beat Sylvia, using her as a punching bag, and Gertrude would humiliate her, forcing her to undress and perform sexual acts for their entertainment. Gertrude expelled Sylvia from school as punishment for stealing a gym suit, which Sylvia had done because Gertrude refused to buy her clothes. This cruelty led to severe physical abuse, including beatings with a police belt and kicks to the genitals. Despite Stephanie's attempts to intervene, Gertrude continued to torment them, inflicting further pain by burning their fingertips with matches and whipping them. A few days later, Gertrude again employed the police belt to repeatedly whip Jenny after she allegedly stole a single tennis shoe from school to wear on her stronger foot. Due to the escalating frequency and brutality of the torture and mistreatment, Sylvia gradually became incontinent, a condition for which she was denied access to the bathroom and forced to wet herself as further punishment. On October 6, 1965, Gertrude confined Sylvia to the basement, binding her with rope. She often kept Sylvia naked, providing her with minimal sustenance and frequently denying her water. Sylvia was consistently tied to the stair railing in the basement, her feet barely touching the ground. The Banfi family would occasionally interrupt their physical and emotional torment to watch their favorite TV shows. Neighborhood boys would even pay 5 cents each to view Sylvia's body on display, participating in her humiliation, beating, burning, and mutilation during her captivity in the basement. Gertrude and her restrained and silenced Sylvia then submerged her in a bathtub of scorching hot water. Next, they rubbed salt into her injuries. After this incident, an anonymous caller, who was the father of a neighborhood boy named Michael John Monroe, contacted Arsenal School to report that a girl with severe skin lesions was living at the Banfi household. Since Sylvia had been absent from school for several days, a school nurse visited Gertrude's residence to investigate. Gertrude claimed to the nurse that Sylvia had run away from home the previous week and that she was unaware of her current whereabouts. She also alleged that Sylvia's skin lesions were a result of her poor personal hygiene and that she was a negative influence on both her own children and her sister. The school did not pursue any further investigation into Sylvia's whereabouts or well-being. In mid-October, John Benazzi Jr. subjected Sylvia to a cruel and sadistic prank. He offered her a plate of soup, only to swiftly pull it away as she attempted to eat with her hands, which was difficult for her due to her severe malnutrition. Afterwards, Gertrude permitted Sylvia to sleep upstairs, but warned her that she must not wet the bed. Before going to sleep, Sylvia quietly asked Jenny for a glass of water, hoping to avoid dehydration. However, the next morning, Gertrude found that Sylvia had urinated on herself, and as a punishment, forced her to perform a humiliating and degrading act, masturbating with a glass bottle in front of the Bambi children. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude shouted for Sylvia to return to the kitchen, then ordered her to strip naked before proclaiming that she had branded her daughters, and now she was going to brand her. Gertrude began carving the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," onto Sylvia's abdomen with a heated needle. When Gertrude was unable to complete the markings, she instructed 14-year-old Richard Hobbs to finish etching the words into Sylvia's flesh while she took Jenny to a nearby grocery store. In what Hobbs would later insist were short, light etchings, he continued to brand the text into Sylvia's abdomen as she clenched her teeth and moaned. Richard and 10-year-old Shirley forcibly took Sylvia to the basement. There, they attempted to inflict a burn on Sylvia's body, specifically beneath her left breast, using an anchor bolt to create a mark resembling the letter S. However, due to their mistake of applying part of the loop in reverse, the resulting deep burn scar would instead look like the number 3. On that grim night, after enduring terrible abuse, Sylvia told her sister Jenny that she knew Jenny didn't want her to die, but she was sure she was going to die. The next day, Gertrude woke Sylvia and forced her to write a letter while dictating its contents. The plan was sinister. They intended to deceive Sylvia's parents into believing that Sylvia had run away from the Banfi residence. The content of this letter was intended to frame a group of anonymous local boys for extensively abusing and mutilating Sylvia after she had initially agreed to engage in sexual relations with them. After writing the letter, Sylvia was again tied to the basement stair railing, while Gertrude finalized her plan to abandon her in Jimmy's forest with the help of John Jr. and Jenny. Gertrude offered Sylvia cookies, but she refused, saying, "Give them to the dog, I don't want them." Enraged, Gertrude forced the cookies into Sylvia's mouth, and then she and John brutally beat her, targeting her stomach. On the morning of October 26th, Sylvia's condition had deteriorated. She could hardly speak or control her movements. Gertrude brought her to the kitchen, propping her against the wall, and tried to feed her a donut and a glass of milk. However, Sylvia struggled to hold the glass, which further infuriated Gertrude, who tossed her to the floor before returning her to the basement. Soon, Sylvia became delirious, repeatedly moaning and muttering incoherently. When Paula asked her to recite the alphabet, Sylvia couldn't get past the first 4 letters and was unable to stand up from the floor. Sylvia faced neighborhood bullies in the basement. She pointed out familiar faces, shouting names. After a failed attempt to bite a rotten pear, Jenny reminded her she couldn't feel her teeth, having lost one at 7. Exhausted and desperate, Sylvia tried to escape, but collapsed. Gertrude punished her brutally, striking her head and knocking her out. Shortly after, at 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs returned to the Banfi residence and rushed to the basement, where he found Stephanie crying and cradling Sylvia's frail, wounded body. After their mother instructed Stephanie to clean Sylvia's body, she and Richard decided to give Sylvia a warm, soothing bath and dress her in fresh clothes. They laid her on a mattress in one of the bedrooms, where she whispered her final wish, for her father to be by her side or to be taken home. After suffering severe punishment and weakening from starvation, Sylvia finally succumbed to her injuries and died. When Stephanie realized Sylvia wasn't breathing, she attempted to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, while Gertrude hysterically screamed at the children in the house that Sylvia was faking her own death. Initially, Gertrude struck Sylvia's lifeless body with a book, yelling at her that she was lying and pretending, in a futile attempt to rouse her. Soon, overcome with panic, Gertrude instructed Richard Hobbs to call the authorities from a nearby payphone. When the police arrived at the address around 6:30 p.m., Gertrude escorted the officers to the bedroom, where she revealed Sylvia's brutally beaten and mutilated body lying on a dirty mattress. She then handed over the letter that Sylvia had been coerced into writing. Gertrude claimed to have cared for the young girl for over an hour before her death, applying antiseptic to her wounds in a futile attempt at first aid. According to Gertrude, Sylvia had run away from home with a group of teenagers. Returning to her house that afternoon, bare-chested and clutching the note. Having declared to everyone in the house that Sylvia's death was meant to happen, Paula looked at Jenny and calmly said that if Jenny wanted to live with them, they would treat her like their own sister. Following instructions she had received before the police arrived, Jenny recited the rehearsed version of the events leading up to Sylvia's death, before whispering to the officers to take them away, and that she would tell them everything. The formal statement from Jenny Likens led to the arrest of Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. Benazzi on suspicion of Sylvia's murder, just hours after her body was discovered. That same day, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same crimes. The 3 older Benazzi children, along with Coy Hubbard, were placed in a nearby juvenile detention center, while the younger Benazzi children and Richard Hobbs were held at the Indianapolis Child Guardians Home, all detained without bail pending trial. Initially, Gertrude denied any involvement in Sylvia's death, but only a day into her detention, she confessed to knowing the children and acknowledged that her daughter Paula and Coy Hubbard had physically and emotionally abused Sylvia. Gertrude also admitted to forcing the girl to sleep in the basement on approximately 3 occasions when she had wet the bed. When an officer suggested that the probable reasons for Sylvia's incontinence were her mental distress and kidney injuries, Gertrude became evasive. Paula showed no remorse, signing a statement that admitted to repeatedly beating Sylvia. She also confessed to fracturing Sylvia's wrist and committing other brutal acts, including pushing her down the basement stairs 2 or 3 times. John Jr. confessed to whipping Sylvia once and frequently using his fist to abuse her, also admitting to burning her with matches on multiple occasions. The autopsy of Sylvia's body revealed over 150 separate injuries across her body, and she was severely emaciated at the time of her death. The injuries varied in location, nature, severity, and healing stage, including burns, severe bruises, and extensive damage to muscles and nerves. Her vaginal cavity was swollen and nearly closed, although an examination determined her hymen was still intact, debunking Gertrude's claims that Sylvia had been 3 months pregnant and the accusations of prostitution and promiscuity. Case 9. Martha McKay's family history was deeply rooted in wealth and legacy. Her great-grandfather, Colonel Robert Snowden, was a Confederate Civil War veteran who began laying the foundation for the family's fortune after returning home to Memphis, Tennessee after the war. He did it by accumulating land and properties and pursuing lucrative business ventures. The Colonel's marriage to and Overton Brinkley brought further prosperity to both families, and was the daughter of Robert Campbell Brinkley, a railroad and real estate tycoon responsible for the Peabody Hotel and parts of downtown Memphis. Her father also played a key role in the development of the Memphis to Little Rock Railroad, spurring regional growth and founding the town of Brinkley, Arkansas, named after the prominent family. The family's wealth and influence continued to flourish through subsequent generations. Their son, Robert Brinkley Snowden, and grandson, Robert Snowden II, continued to acquire land. By the early 1900s, grandson Snowden II and his wife, Grace, acquired 1,000 acres of land along peaceful Horseshoe Lake, Arkansas, the location central to this case. Horseshoe was a picturesque lake located about 30 miles from Memphis. It was on the lake that Robert and Grace built their home, the Snowden house. During their time in the home, it was transformed into an impressive 6,000 square foot mansion. With its marble floors and grand staircase, it was the crown jewel of the family's legacy. Initially, the home served as a family retreat where they would host lavish weddings, summer gatherings, and family celebrations. The family had other properties on the 1,000-acre lake as well. Robert and Grace had 5 children, who all grew up in the Snowden house, then went off to start their own families. But when Robert passed away, he left one of his daughters, Sally, the task of managing the estate in his place. Having weathered multiple failed marriages, Sally returned to the 30-cabin Snowden house to pick up the reins. Under her oversight, the property flourished, transitioning into a venue for weddings, reunions, and other events. This shift marked the house's gradual conversion into a bed and breakfast, a vision that would later be fully realized by Sally's daughter, Martha McKay. But being a rich, prominent family in the community did not make them immune from tragedy. In 1996, Sally Snowden McKay was in her mid-70s. One summer morning in September, she and her 52-year-old nephew, Memphis blues musician Joseph Lee Baker, were at one of their Horseshoe Lake properties. Joseph was very well known and loved in the local music scene, often performing at local venues, and even having performed in the past at the Memphis Country Blues Festival. He lived on the lake with his wife and 3 children, and also taught at the local high school. But on that summer morning, on the lake where the wealthy family had shared so many fond memories, a brutal crime would take place against the seemingly untouchable family that would shock everyone. Just a few houses down from the Snowden house, at the home Sally and Joseph were in at the time, 16-year-old Travis Lewis had broken in, presumably in an attempted robbery, thinking that no one was home. Travis wasn't just a random intruder. His grandparents actually rented their home from the McKays, and his mother Gladys worked as a housekeeper at the Snowden house. Joseph had also once been Travis' high school English teacher. The young teen had a criminal history, including a conviction for assault. Familiar with the family and their routines, Travis saw an opportunity for a burglary. But when he found Sally and Joseph inside the home, things went terribly wrong. Panic set in, and in a desperate attempt to avoid being caught, Travis shot them both. To cover his tracks, he set the house on fire, then tried escaping in Sally's car. But that didn't go well either. Travis crashed and flipped the car into a ditch about a mile from the house, leaving it wrecked and abandoned. And although he had bashed his head on the windshield, he still managed to escape on foot. Back at the scene, firefighters were alerted almost immediately to the fire, which had engulfed the home. After the fire was contained, they discovered Sally and Joseph's bodies. Autopsy reports would later show that they were both shot and killed before the fire was set. Shortly after the murder, neighbors discovered Sally's crashed and abandoned car as well. Police launched a search for the suspect, matching the assailant's description. Meanwhile, the loss of the 2 prominent family members sent shockwaves through the community. It wasn't just that a violent crime had taken 2 lives. It was the fact that it happened in a place so deeply intertwined with the family and the city's history. It didn't take long for authorities to close in on Travis. His fingerprints were found at the scene, and under questioning, he confessed to being at the estate but claimed that he had an accomplice, and that accomplice was the one who actually shot Sally and Joseph. The story didn't hold up. The person he named had an ironclad alibi. The evidence pointed to Travis alone, and there was no evidence of anyone else being involved. The prosecution tried Travis as an adult, and faced with a possible death sentence, he pleaded guilty to avoid trial. He accepted a plea deal, which resulted in him being sentenced to 28.5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 70% of his time. The McKay family was comfortable with the plea deal, not wanting to go through the emotional strain of a trial, particularly since the case had already amassed a near-cult following due to Joseph's popularity on the blues scene. It seemed like justice had been served, but Travis's sentence would not mark the end. After Sally and Joseph's murders, one of Sally's sisters, Edith Snowden Dewey, stepped in to take over the family business. But then in 2004, shortly before Edith passed away, it was time to hand over the reins to the Snowden house again. This time to Sally's daughter, Martha McKay. Born into the prominent Snowden family, Martha grew up spending summers at the Snowden house. Those idyllic summers foster her love for the estate. So after having mourned the loss of her mother at the hands of Travis, and after living for years on the West Coast, Martha returned to Horseshoe Lake to buy the Snowden house from her family located just a few doors down from where her mother was murdered 8 years earlier. She meticulously renovated the home, transforming it into an elegant, luxurious bed and breakfast and wedding venue. Known for her charisma, Martha became known as the Lady of the Lake. The Snowden house evolved into a destination known for its upscale vacation homes and became a popular gathering place for artists, businessmen, and socialites. Under Martha's direction, it became one of Memphis' most sought-after event venues, especially for weddings. In a 2015 interview with Memphis Magazine, Martha reflected on her childhood at Horseshoe Lake, describing it as nothing short of magical, stating, "I felt like I was royalty. With the big house and servants. Everything was fresh from the garden. Fresh eggs and all. We even had a peach orchard. We swam every day. It was just ideal." Martha enjoyed hosting events at the estate and became a beloved figure within the local community. To those who knew her, this came as no surprise, as many described her as a kind and compassionate person who genuinely cared for others. And it wasn't just talk. Martha worked hard to ensure her actions reflected her values. She developed a deep interest in Buddhism and eventually embraced the practice herself. Through Buddhism, she focused on letting go of as part of her personal growth, focusing instead on its teachings of compassion and forgiveness. She was determined that her forgiveness would be genuine. She fully committed to it, both in thought and in action. So much so that even though her mother and cousin were brutally murdered at the estate in 1996, Martha sought to forgive the person responsible. She started writing letters to Travis while he was in prison. And despite her family's objections, she even visited him regularly, seeking to understand the young man who had taken her mother's life, and feeling at some level that someone else was at least partially involved. But overall, she believed that Travis' actions were those of a scared, misguided boy rather than a cold-blooded killer. Over time, she grew to trust him, believing that he had changed. In 2018, after serving over 20 years behind bars and 70% of his sentence, 38-year-old Travis Lewis was up for parole. And Martha was right there. She had been a vocal supporter of his early release, in stark contrast to every other member of her family. And as surprising as it was to everyone that Martha forgave her mother's killer, she took it even further than that, befriending the man who she believed showed promise. When Travis was released, Martha offered him not only a place to live at the Snowden house, but she also gave him a job as a groundskeeper, working alongside his mother, Gladys, who was still employed as a housekeeper there. Travis happily took her up on her offer. She had demonstrated what most would consider the ultimate test of forgiveness. To most observers, including many family members, the decision was foolish at best and dangerous at worst. But the arrangement seemed to be going well, at least at first. Travis kept a low profile, and Martha believed she was playing a significant role in his rehabilitation, helping him get back on his feet. But that didn't last long. Travis' behavior began to change noticeably, alarming even his mother, Gladys. Gladys warned Martha to be cautious, telling her that Travis was slipping back into his old ways. And it wasn't long before her fears were confirmed. Travis had started stealing again. Around that time, Martha had sold one of the estate's extravagant chandeliers for $14,000 in cash. She placed the money in an envelope and hid it within the house. But soon, the cash had mysteriously disappeared. In her diary, Martha admitted that deep down, she knew Travis was responsible. There was no one else who could have taken it. Gladys' warning only reinforced her suspicions. With no other option, Martha decided to fire Travis and ban him from the Snowden house, realizing that despite her efforts to forgive and help rehabilitate him, she could not allow him to remain in her life. That decision would lead directly to the devastating and ironic events of March 25, 2020. On that morning, Martha pressed a silent alarm from within the historic estate that alerted the police. 2 officers were dispatched to the Snowden house. Once there, they saw that the back door was wide open. They went inside to investigate and found Martha's body at the top of the stairs. She had been stabbed and bludgeoned by Travis Lewis, the same man convicted of killing her mother and cousin over 2 full decades earlier. Officers on the scene noticed someone escaping from a second-story window and making a dash for a vehicle. In his attempt to flee, the suspect drove into a patch of mud, getting the car stuck. The escape attempt was eerily reminiscent of the previous murders. Unable to free the car from the mud, Travis abandoned the vehicle and sprinted toward a nearby lake. Officers saw him dive into the water, but never saw him resurface. Inside the Snowden house, officers found a cloth bag filled with valuables resting on a chair near Martha's body, seemingly ready to be stolen. Police determined that Travis intended to steal the valuables. However, it remained unclear whether his plan had initially been to burglarize the home, then killed Martha in the process, or if the main intention was to murder her and the burglary was simply an afterthought. Law enforcement called in teams with sonar equipment to search the lake. They recovered the lifeless body of Travis Lewis. An autopsy revealed that Travis Lewis had a cocktail of drugs in his system at the time of his death. This raised questions about his state of mind, whether he had intended to drown or whether he drowned because he was intoxicated. Regardless, Travis Lewis' fate was sealed when they pulled his lifeless body from the water. The man whom Martha McCain had forgiven for murdering the person most dear to her, and selflessly rallied to help him turn his life around, was dead, and so was Martha. The community was shocked that a killer could return decades later and exact the same brutal fate on the forgiving daughter of the person he first murdered was unthinkable. The family was left both devastated and in disbelief. Despite their consistent warnings to Martha to stay away from her mother's killer, they were still left to mourn the loss of their loving, forgiving family member. Martha's cousin and Joseph Baker's grandson expressed his heartbreak to the media, stating, "It feels like a bad dream or déjà vu. Like we're right back here again. I'm just beyond sad that this is how things ended for her." With Travis Lewis gone, there would be no trial, no verdict, no courtroom justice. For Martha's family, there would be no final chance to uncover every detail of what happened that morning. Instead, they were left with the harsh reality of a story that had come devastatingly full circle, and the bittersweet knowledge that Martha, despite everything, had stayed true to her values of forgiveness, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Case 10. It was Father's Day 2005, and Robert Farquharson loaded his 3 sons into the car, setting off on what seemed like an ordinary drive home after a quick dinner at KFC. The drive began uneventfully, but by the end of the night their car would be submerged at the bottom of a dam, and Robert would be standing alone on the shore smoking a cigarette, emotionless, as rescuers attempted to save his children. They could not. But as questions arose about the crash, the father's behavior, and what really happened on that quiet, unremarkable stretch of road, one thing became clear. Nothing about that night was as simple as it seemed. But fortunately, not everything that sinks stays buried. Robert Farquharson was the youngest of 4 siblings. He grew up in the small town of Winchelsea, located an hour and a half from Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. Known for being quiet, shy, and easygoing, Robert maintained close bonds with his older sisters throughout his youth. After his sisters moved to Geelong for work, they continued to look after Robert, often bringing him along on outings and helping him adjust during his teenage years. Cindy Gambino was kind and generous. She was raised in the town of Baragura, also located in Victoria. Her childhood was filled with outdoor adventures, including bike rides with friends and exploring the Barwon River. Cindy had a passion for music, especially ABBA, and a deep love for the ocean. She often wore the color purple, reflecting her vibrant personality. From an early age, Cindy dreamed of becoming a mother and cherished the simplicity of raising children. However, her early life was marked by tragedy when she lost her partner in a car accident. Despite this heartbreak, Cindy remained resilient, determined to build a happy family and create a life filled with love and purpose. Cindy had known Robert Farquharson since they were teenagers. Following the tragic death of her previous boyfriend in a car accident, Cindy found comfort in Robert's steady presence. Their friendship gradually blossomed into a romantic relationship by 1990. While Cindy felt a strong initial connection to Robert, who was well regarded within the local community, her fascination soon faded. Robert was a reliable figure in her life, often giving her rides home from the pub or local disco. Yet despite his constant presence, Cindy did not feel any deep emotional or romantic connection. She later described feeling as though she had settled for second best. He was reliable and practical, but lacked the passion and chemistry she craved. 6 months into their relationship, Cindy became pregnant. It marked the beginning of challenges between them. Robert was considered by many a mama's boy, having lived at home much longer than his peers. When he met Cindy, who was already living independently, he was drawn to her strength and self-sufficiency. However, the dynamic led Robert to treat Cindy more like a mother figure, expecting her to take care of him in various ways. After being together for about 6 years, Robert and Cindy decided to get married. But even on their wedding day, despite the encouragement from others who were there celebrating the occasion, Cindy had second thoughts. By then they had 2 children, Jay and Tyler, and were later joined by a 3rd child, Bailey. From the early stages of their marriage, issues with Rob's character began to show. He appeared increasingly dissatisfied with his life, particularly with the pressures of work and the need to take on a second job. As their marriage wore on, Robert started to resent Cindy. Her independence and strong-willed personality often clashed with his need for support, leaving him feeling frustrated and overlooked. Over time, this tension built up, especially as Robert struggled with sharing responsibilities, particularly when it came to raising their children. The financial strain on Robert began to affect his behavior at home. He displayed passive tendencies, especially towards the children. He would provoke them until they became upset, particularly targeting his oldest son Jay, who would often end up in tears. Rob's cruel and reportedly even sadistic actions led the children to lose respect for him. He seemed to channel his own anger and dissatisfaction by projecting it onto those around him, creating a toxic environment within the family. As Robert grew more dissatisfied with his job and family life, his marriage began to fall apart. In May of 2004, Cindy crossed paths with Stephen Mules, a local contractor and single father who was working on their property. With Cindy and Robert's relationship deteriorating, Cindy started confiding in Stephen about her unhappiness, seeking his advice. Although Stephen sympathized, he was hesitant to get involved, having just gone through a tough breakup himself. Over time, it became clear to Stephen that Cindy and Robert were heading for a separation. Robert began visiting Stephen's home frequently, looking for support. As a single father himself, Stephen tried to counsel Robert, but he quickly grew frustrated with Robert's constant complaints and lack of effort to improve his situation. After several months of this, Stephen confronted Robert, urging him to stop acting helpless and start taking responsibility for his children. He told Robert that if he wanted to be a father, he needed to like one. The dynamic between Cindy, Robert, and Stephen became increasingly strained, with Stephen unwillingly drawn into their conflict. By November 2004, Cindy had reached her breaking point and asked Robert to move out. As she began to move forward with her life, Robert tried to claim that the separation was mutual and that he was handling it well. In reality, Robert was extremely angry and began stalking Cindy, constantly checking where her car was and who she was with. Those close to Cindy would notice his car passing repeatedly, sometimes circling the block and appearing again. But Cindy was actually moving on. What started out as a friendship between her and Stephen grew into a romantic relationship, and the two of them began dating. Father's Day 2005 began just like any other ordinary day. Cindy started the morning with her and her sons, spending time with her own father. Later, she took the boys to Robert's house, having prepared a special photo of the 3 of them as a gift for him. Afterwards, Cindy returned home, busying herself with getting the boys' school things ready for the next day. As the day wore on, she began to wonder where they were, checking the time and waiting for their return. Robert had taken his 3 sons, 10-year-old Jay, 7-year-old Tyler, and 2-year-old Bailey, on a typical day out. They drove in his 1989 Holden Commodore to Geelong, where the kids picked out a few small items. Jay got a cricket ball and Tyler and Bailey each got a DVD. After stopping at KFC for dinner, they made a brief stop at Farquharson's sister's house, before beginning the drive back to their mother's house in Winchelsea. As Robert drove his children home, the car veered off the road after crossing a railway overpass just outside of Winchelsea. The car crossed into the opposite lane, onto a grassy area, and down a slope, plowing through a wire fence. It barely missed a tree before plunging into a dam. It was pitch black, and the water was cold, a bitter 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Although Robert managed to free himself and swim to safety, his 3 sons were trapped inside the sinking vehicle. After reaching the safety of the water's edge, Farquharson flagged down 2 passing motorists. Instead of using the men's mobile phones to call emergency services, Farquharson insisted that they take him to Cindy Gambino's house, so that he could break the news to her personally. He declined their offer to help rescue the children from the dam, telling them that it was too late, and that his sons were already gone. Since Robert refused their offer to use their phones to call for help, the passers-by called for help themselves. When Cindy heard a car pull up, she thought Robert and the children had finally arrived. But when she opened the door, only Robert was standing there. He stated, "I killed the kids." Confused and horrified, she demanded to know where the children were and why Robert had left them. Cindy, her partner Stephen Mules, and Stephen's son Zach rushed back to the dam. They arrived about 7:45 p.m., 30 minutes after the accident. Robert's vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Cindy, overwhelmed with panic and fear, was frantically running up and down, repeatedly asking where her children were. Emergency 000 was called. "My children are gone. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. So you're saying it's too dark to see out there?" "It's too dark to see anything." "Where are they?" "Hello? Cindy? Hello? Oh my God. Hello?" While Stephen and others repeatedly dived into the icy water to search for the children, Farquharson stood off to the side, smoking a cigarette and showing no emotion. Stephen would later describe him as standing like a boss overseeing a project at work. At one point, Robert had asked Stephen for a cigarette, and his response was incredulous. "What? Where are your kids? Get out of my face." Desperate to find the children, Stephen frantically searched several spots. Emergency responders arrived shortly after beginning their recovery efforts. When Stephen saw them preparing ropes, he grabbed one, tying it around his waist, determined to dive back in. But the authorities stopped him, warning him that it was too dangerous. The first ambulance on the scene was directed to Robert, who was identified as the driver of the vehicle. The paramedics quickly learned that 3 children were still trapped in the submerged car. One of the paramedics observed Robert standing by Cindy's car, legs slightly apart, arms folded, seemingly detached from the chaos around him. The fact that he was not comforting Cindy, who was visibly distraught, struck the paramedic as strange. Meanwhile, officers from the Victoria Police Major Collision Investigation Unit arrived at the dam. With years of experience investigating road incidents, they quickly sensed that something was amiss. Typically, when a car runs off the road, the driver panics, oversteers, and loses control, leaving telltale marks on the road. Initially, the officers thought this might be the case, so they set up a lighting system to search for such marks along the road. Their search revealed no such markings, raising their suspicions. As police continued their investigation at the scene, Robert Farquharson was taken to a local hospital for a medical examination. Detectives soon joined him there, eager to hear his account as the sole witness to the incident. Expecting to find someone who was distraught, disheveled, and shaken by the ordeal, the detectives were surprised to find Robert relatively calm. Robert began telling them his account of the night's events. He claimed that he had turned on the car's heater, which triggered him to have a coughing fit. He said he eventually blacked out from coughing, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. According to his story, he realized too late that the car had crashed and was rapidly sinking into the dam. He described his efforts to save the children by diving under the water to reach them, but the detectives were suspicious of Robert's story. His appearance was not consistent with someone who had just dived into cold, murky water, particularly his not wet, well-groomed hair. Back at the scene, any lingering hopes for a rescue had long since faded. It was 12:40 a.m., and everyone knew there was no possibility of pulling the boys out of the water alive. Approximately 5 hours after the car had plunged into the dam, a police diver located the vehicle. It was found in a vertical position, nose down, stuck in the mud. The driver's side door was open, and Jay, the eldest son, was partially out of the vehicle, his upper body hanging through the door. A heartbreaking finding that deeply affected those at the scene. All 3 children had their seatbelts unbuckled, presumably in a desperate attempt to escape. The car was retrieved from the dam, water hopelessly cascading out as it surfaced. One of the first things that caught the investigators' attention was that the ignition, heater, and headlights were all turned off. This increased their suspicions about Robert's coughing fit claim. The headlights being off, especially at night, clashed with his account of driving normally before blacking out. The heater being off contradicted his story that it was the cause of his coughing fit, and turning off the ignition would have been a very strange action to perform under such instant and terrifying circumstances. Meanwhile, Cindy, suffering from severe shock, had been taken to a hospital in Winchelsea. So, the heartbreaking task of identifying the children fell to Stephen. He found Jay in a body bag on the ground and quietly said a prayer for him. As the police continued their investigation, the family faced the heartbreaking task of preparing the funeral for the three boys. The children were laid to rest in Winchelsea Cemetery, where Cindy had arranged for a burial plot beside her sons, intending to one day be buried next to them. However, unbeknownst to Cindy, Robert had also booked a burial plot for himself next to the children and Cindy, a disturbing move considering their estranged relationship and the questionable circumstances surrounding the children's deaths. To many, it seemed like Robert's twisted attempt to ensure that he would be reunited with Cindy in death despite her no longer wanting him in life. Police brought Farquharson in for questioning. He continued his claim that he had experienced a severe coughing fit that caused him to black out while driving. Robert adamantly denies any intent to harm his children. Police ask him if he drove into the dam deliberately, but as he's claiming that he did not, he does so while nodding his head, a body language cue that contradicts what he's actually saying. He reasserts that the accident was caused by a blackout resulting from a coughing fit, but as he continues to do throughout the interview, he is shaking his head while he's claiming it's the honest truth, body language that indicates that it is not the honest truth. It all casts further doubt on the credibility of his claims. Law enforcement continued investigating the deaths of the Farquharson children, carefully gathering evidence from the crash site and detailed statements from key witnesses. Within a few months, they felt they had sufficient cause to arrest Robert Farquharson. They did so in December of 2005. He would remain in custody until this trial, which would take place nearly 2 years later in August of 2007. Throughout the investigation and the trial, Cindy insisted that Robert could not deliberately harm their children. At his trial, she testified on his behalf, describing him as a loving father and insisting that the crash was a tragic accident. She became a key witness for the defense, offering an emotional account how Robert was a caring parent who had simply lost control of the vehicle due to his unfortunate medical event. But the prosecution presented a wealth of evidence to challenge Robert's claims. To dispute Farquharson's claim that he blacked out from coughing, the prosecution presented the testimony of a sleep medicine expert who claimed that blacking out due to coughing, known as cough syncope, was extremely rare and unlikely to have occurred in Farquharson's case. His testimony convinced the jury that Farquharson's account was implausible. Then on to the physical evidence. One of the early analysis investigators performed was to examine the actual crime scene. They looked for any signs that the vehicle had lost control, such as skid marks or sudden overcorrections. They found no such indicators. The absence of these marks indicated to law enforcement that Robert deliberately steered the car into the dam. In fact, instead of skid marks, investigators found quite the opposite. The prosecution presented a computer-generated reenactment to demonstrate the path Robert Farquharson's vehicle took from the road to the dam. This simulation highlighted 3 distinct steering changes that occurred as the car left the road. They argued that these steering adjustments could not have occurred if Robert had been unconscious, as he claimed. The first input was to turn off the roadway. The second input was to straighten the tires and continue on a straight path. The third was a deliberate veer to the right to avoid a tree, just before the car plunged into the dam. They argued that each of those changes in direction required deliberate physical actions from the driver. They explained that if Robert had truly blacked out, the car would not have these controlled movements. Instead, it likely would have drifted in a straight line or shown chaotic movement, not the precise corrections seen in the reenactment. Investigators also reenacted submerging a car in a dam. In their test, the vehicle took nearly 8 minutes to fill with water before eventually sinking, leaving plenty of time for Robert to save his children. This reenactment was a turning point in the trial, with the prosecution arguing that Robert had the opportunity to act, but chose not to, reinforcing their theory that his actions were all intentional. In addition to the physical evidence, detectives also scrutinized Robert's behavior leading up to the crash, looking for clues that might explain his actions. Robert had become increasingly fixated on material possessions, particularly what he referred to as the good car that Cindy had taken, leaving him with what he saw as the inferior family car. This division of assets seemed grossly unfair to him, fueling his anger and resentment. And then there was the witness. A critical piece of the prosecution's case came from Greg King, a friend of Robert's. King claimed that a few months before the incident, he had a conversation with Robert in which Robert's simmering anger towards Cindy became evident, especially regarding the good car. As they talked, Cindy happened to pull up in that very car, intensifying Robert's anger. According to Greg, Robert hinted that he was planning to pay her back big time. When Greg pressed Robert on what he meant, Robert indicated that he would take away what mattered most to Cindy. When he asked for clarification, Robert nodded toward the fish and chip shop where Cindy was with the children, implying that he was referring to the kids. Greg was horrified. He admonished Robert, telling him to not even think such things, let alone say them aloud. He reminded Robert that those were his own flesh and blood. At the time, Greg dismissed the comment as Robert simply venting his frustrations, never imagining that he would follow through on such a horrific threat. However, Greg's account of the incident was not consistent when he reported it to the authorities, supplying them with 3 different accounts of the conversation over time. While his initial versions were less specific, his final version made Robert's intent to harm the children as revenge for Cindy ending their relationship very clear. Despite Greg's inconsistent statements to authorities, his testimony was keyed during the first trial. The defense challenged Greg's credibility, suggesting that his shifting narrative weakened the reliability of his statements. But the prosecution stressed that Greg's final account matched other evidence pointing to Robert's actions as intentional. The trial captured national attention with public opinion deeply divided over Robert's guilt. Many found it difficult to believe that a father could commit such a horrific act, while others viewed the reenactments in Greg King's testimony as overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The emotional strain of the trial was significant, especially for Cindy Gambino, who found herself increasingly torn between her belief in Robert's innocence and the growing weight of the evidence against him. On October 2, 2007, just 2 days before Jay's 13th birthday, the jury began deliberations. They found Robert Farquharson guilty of murdering his 3 children. Cindy Gambino was devastated by the verdict. She and her mother, both overwhelmed by emotion in court, required medical assistance. Farquharson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. News of the conviction was a surprise to many. Some legal professionals expressed shock at the guilty verdict. Melbourne barrister David Galbally stated that many barristers believed the defense had presented sufficient evidence to establish reasonable doubt. He predicted that the forensic issues raised during a trial would likely lead to a retrial. And he was right. Following the trial, Farquharson's defense team filed an appeal. In it, they raised concerns about the validity and reliability of the prosecution's evidence. They also challenged the reliability of Greg King's testimony. The court agreed. They overturned Farquharson's conviction and granted him a new trial. Robert Farquharson's second trial began on May 5, 2010. Among the defense's arguments was that the video simulation presented by the prosecution did not reflect the actual circumstances of the crash, including the terrain, road conditions, and other factors. The court agreed, and the video simulation was excluded from evidence. However, the car sinking reenactment, which demonstrated how long it would take for a similar car to be submerged, was still allowed. Having previously dismissed the notion that Robert had killed their children as an act of revenge against her, Cindy Gambino eventually came to believe that he was guilty. A key turning point for her was the testimony of witness Dawn Waite during the second trial. Dawn said that she had not come forward during the first trial because she was diagnosed with cancer. She said she figured that the prosecution had a strong case, and that she would just be one of many witnesses, so they didn't meet her. But after seeing that he had been released pending a new trial, she came forward. She recounted that on the night of the incident, she happened to be driving behind Farquharson's car. She said that he was repeatedly braking, then proceeding, then braking, as if searching for a specific spot as he was looking deliberately toward the dam. She decided to pass him, concerned that he might cause an accident with his erratic driving. And when she did, she said that she could see that he was neither coughing nor incapacitated. Once she passed him, she said that she could see in her rearview mirror that he veered off the road. Convinced by that testimony, Cindy switched sides. In stark contrast to the testimony she provided for the defense in the first trial, she testified against Robert at his retrial. Robert also took the stand in his own defense, and as a sergeant from the Victoria Police Department observed, he dug himself a hole that he couldn't get out of. He was unable to give answers to the questions posed to him, and his answer to anything that would incriminate him was, "I can't remember." As the police sergeant noted, the jury got to see the same Robert that they saw at the hospital the night of the crash, the one whose behavior led them to the conclusion that he had killed his kids. Between Robert's abysmal performance on the stand, Cindy's withdrawal of support for him, the witness testimonies, and the reintroduction of the sinking car test, The jury once again found Robert guilty of murdering his 3 children. He was sentenced again to life with a minimum of 33 years. In the years following the tragedy, Stephen and Cindy got married and would go on to have 2 sons of their own. But their lives were never the same. Their irreversible pain was heartbreakingly evident in the powerful victim impact statement Stephen prepared for Robert's sentencing. It read in part, September the 4th, 2005. I spent some time in freezing water looking for Cindy and Robert's 3 boys. Since that night, I have not dived into water again, something they used to enjoy so much. To this day, and probably forever, I will never forget the 3 little faces that I saw that night. Every time I picture them, I break into tears, and I wonder if I will do that for the rest of my life. I find myself crying with both anger and resentment. Resentment at Robert as well as myself. Because although I did not do this heinous act, I felt and still do feel that I let both Cindy and her boys down that night because I was not able to find them. Unlike Robert though, I did at least try. I now drink consistently, am on painkillers and calmatives, and am an absolute shell of the person I was. I no longer have a concreting company. Rather, I am now a full-time carer. I no longer laugh as a regular thing. Rather, I am grumpy, tired, worn out, and focus only on the everyday running of our family and home. As Cindy basically does not function anymore, I am the full-time cook and carer of just about everything. Cindy and I rarely laugh together. In fact, intimacy. What's that? I continually have headaches and neck aches. I find I don't look after myself anymore. I shower less frequent, brush my teeth less frequent. We rarely go out. I miss both the person that I was and the true happy-go-lucky, fun-loving woman that I met in Cindy. Both I am not sure that either of us will ever be or see again. After the horrific loss of her sons, Cindy became a tireless advocate for justice. As Stephen outlined, her life was never the same after the deaths of her children. She was later interviewed and tearfully reflected regarding Robert. I hate him with a passion. I don't wish death on him because I want him to suffer. I hate what he's done to me. On May 10th, 2022, at the age of 50, Cindy Gambino passed away after suffering a medical episode. There was no indication of foul play in her passing, and her death has been reported as natural, stemming from a medical condition. In a statement, Cindy's family remembered her as a warrior for justice who fought relentlessly after the devastating loss of her sons. In January 2024, nearly 20 years after Robert Farquharson's conviction, the Victorian government stripped him of control over his son's grave sites at Winchelsea Cemetery. The change came because of new legislation passed in 2021, which allows the state to revoke burial rights from convicted murderers and serious criminals. Farquharson's name, previously engraved on the headstone as the father of much loved and cherished children, was removed. It was the first time the new law was applied. The Department of Health also ensured that Farquharson would not be buried in a neighboring plot, which had been a concern of Cindy's before she passed away. Robert Farquharson was sent to serve his sentence at the HM Prison Barwon in Lara, Victoria, Australia. Updates on his day-to-day prison life are limited. Since his incarceration at Barwon, Robert has reportedly lived in the protection unit, which houses high-profile and vulnerable inmates. While in prison, Robert claimed to have experienced another episode of cough syncope 4 years into his sentence. He said he began coughing again and, as witnessed by another inmate, collapsed and woke up after a few seconds, with a fractured ankle from the collapse. His legal team argued that this subsequent episode further demonstrated the authenticity of his cough-induced blackouts. After his second conviction, Robert Farquharson launched subsequent appeals in 2012 and 2013. Both were unsuccessful. Despite the failure of his previous appeals, Farquharson has caught a stroke of luck. Recent legislative changes now allow previously resolved cases to be reopened if new and compelling evidence surfaces, giving his case renewed momentum. As a result, scientific and legal experts, as well as investigative journalists, are raising concerns about whether flawed evidence or junk science influenced the original trials. Specifically being called into question are the Victoria Police's car-sinking reenactment, which was used during both trials as it showed a car slowly sinking over the course of 8 minutes, presumably affording Robert plenty of time to save his children. However, a forensic expert who specializes in vehicle submersion scenarios recently criticized the reconstruction as flawed, pointing out that it was performed in 2.8 meters of water, significantly more shallow than the dam's actual depth of 7.4 meters. He explained that in deeper water, the car would have sunk almost immediately, and most certainly within a few seconds, once the door was opened. It would have left little chance for escape, let alone rescuing his children. He concluded that the video was misleading and did not reflect real conditions. Experts also reviewed the original crash simulation video, with one expert calling it Looney Tunes for not accurately reflecting real conditions. That simulation, which was shown during the first trial, depicted a completely flat terrain with no obstacles, no slope, no fence that Robert plowed through. So experts recently created their own, accurate 3D simulation, which included those missing elements. With that accurate simulation, the steering shifts that the prosecution argued Robert must have made deliberately were actually consistent with how the car would have naturally responded to each terrain change and obstacle that he encountered. According to the experts, the only intentional steering action needed would have been for Robert to veer off of the road, something they argue could have happened accidentally during a coughing fit. Farquharson's cough syncope claim is also being revisited. A highly regarded respiratory specialist has pointed out that Farquharson, who had a chest infection at the time of the accident, fits the typical profile of a person prone to cough syncope, namely being a middle-aged male, overweight, and with a history of smoking. In his professional opinion, it was around 90% probable that Farquharson did indeed experience a cough syncope episode on the night of the crash. Farquharson's claim got an unexpected boost when in October 2015, truck driver Jeffrey Ferguson blacked out from a cough syncope episode while driving, causing a fatal crash. In Farquharson's case, he actually had corroboration. He happened to be on the phone with his brother during the incident, providing confirmation of the blackout. Farquharson was initially convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison, but he served only 2 years before appealing and winning his case. Notably, the same medical expert who testified against Farquharson, claiming that cough syncope was rare, also testified against Ferguson. Farquharson's defense is now using Ferguson's case to support his upcoming appeal. And then there were those witnesses. Both Greg King's inconsistent accounts of his conversation with Robert and Don Wade's testimony at the second trial came under intense scrutiny. When investigative journalists probed deeper into Don's account of the evening, she revealed an inaccuracy that had been missed during a trial. She admitted that she had a receipt showing that she was at a restaurant 30 minutes away from the crash at the time the crash occurred. If accurate, that would have made it impossible for her to have witnessed the events just prior to the crash, as she claimed. Dawn's credibility coming under question was particularly troubling because her account was considered uncontested by the Court of Appeal and also played a significant role in shaping the outcome of the case. Her testimony was what convinced Cindy of Robert's guilt, leading her to switch sides and testify against him. Police had also used Dawn's statements to support their analysis of the crash path. In light of the new evidence, the Australian Academy of Science has taken the rare step of calling for a judicial review of Farquharson's case. They argue that the justice system failed to apply proper scientific standards to the evidence presented at trial, potentially leading to a miscarriage of justice. Farquharson's lawyer and supporters hope that this fresh evidence will lay the groundwork for a new appeal, and with it, a chance at exoneration. Currently, Robert Farquharson remains in prison, where he has served nearly 2 decades. Barring any successful appeal, he will be eligible for parole in the year 2043. Farquharson's case leaves more questions than answers, with some convinced he's innocent, others certain of his guilt, and many people unsure but focused on proper evidence analysis and standards in the judicial system.